Chapter 2760. It was as if the isolation method didn't exist in the face of the power of the tribulation. Even if the isolation measures cast by the Creator of the world could actually isolate the world, and he was even confident that such measures would have a certain effect on the simulation of the state of chaos if placed outside the world, it did not have any effect at all in the face of the power of the tribulation. The might of the tribulation was completely unobstructed, and it passed through these obstructions and spread towards the entire world at an unimaginable speed. At that moment, a voice rang out from the black hole. "I want to live forever." Along with the voice, a feeling of eternity broke through and began to expand and strengthen wildly. In the end, the great Tao of longevity that had been projected to various parts of the world through the sacred mountain seemed to be distorted by some unimaginable power. As the rivers twisted, like 100 rivers flowing into the ocean, they surged towards the black hole on their own. It was as if the black hole was emitting an attractive force that targeted the paths of immortality. An immortal light gradually emerged from the black hole. In the beginning, the light was incomparably weak. However, as various changes occurred and the great Tao of longevity poured into it, it grew stronger at a furious rate. In just a few dozen breaths of time, he had expanded to the size of a human figure, and the light he emitted broke through the barrier of the black hole. Accompanied by the boundless power of the tribulations, it spread throughout the world. At that moment, the Creator could no longer stay on the sacred mountain and watch from afar. He frowned, and in a flash, he traversed a boundless distance and arrived at the location of the black hole from the sacred mountain. When he arrived here, his whole body made a sizzling sound. The boundless power of the tribulations was like some kind of super-corrosive power, and it began to crazily corrode his body. The sizzling sound was produced when the corrosive force was blocked by his power. What a powerful force! The Creator looked down at the black hole and sensed the power of the tribulation corroding his body. His expression turned even more unsightly. This was his world, and everything in it belonged to him. And now, such a black hole was wildly destroying his world, and the path of immortality that threatened to shake his fundamental beliefs had appeared out of nowhere. How could he not be furious? At that moment, the figure formed by the light gradually took shape. In the end, after who knew how many breaths, he finally broke away from the light and appeared outside the black hole. This figure was naturally the cultivator that the Creator of this world had casually erased earlier. However, compared to before, the eternal aura that this cultivator emitted was tens of thousands of times stronger. If it could be said that he was only slightly tainted with this kind of immortality before, then the current him was completely like the embodiment of immortality. This was indeed the case. At this moment, in the eyes of the Creator of this world, this cultivator had indeed become the eternal manifestation of this world. In other words, he had become the representative of the great Tao of longevity. At that moment, he seemed to be an independent being, but in reality, he was just an image of the path of immortality. Although it seemed like he had an independent mind and a perfect self, it was all because the path of immortality did not have a mind or a self. Because the path of immortality did not have a mind or a self, his will became the will of the path of immortality as he fused with it. It seemed like he had not changed at all. However, that was to be expected. After all, he had already been completely destroyed by the means of the Creator of this world. As the Creator of this world, even a casual action of his could cause great destruction to everything in this world. This living being could be said to have been completely destroyed just now. Even the last bit of willpower, the last bit of obsession, was only preserved by the great Tao of immortality because it was compatible with it. How could he be resurrected so easily in such a state? However, in reality, this kind of reappearance was not much different from resurrection. At the very least, that was the case for this cultivator. At that moment, facing the Creator of this world, he instinctively knew that this was his enemy, the greatest obstacle to his survival. Only by defeating him and making him acknowledge him could he continue to live and enjoy the eternity and longevity that he had obtained with great difficulty. "Are you my enemy?" the incarnation of the path of immortality said to the creator of this world. "I didn't expect it to appear in this way. Looks like I've underestimated you." The creator of this world looked at the cultivator and sighed with a grave expression. In his eyes, the cultivator in front of him was not a living being that he had created. Instead, it was merely the convergence of the power of the tribulations, the embodiment of the power of the tribulations. Moreover, it wasn't just a single incarnation, but a whole abstract incarnation formed by the accumulation of countless incarnations. The cultivator felt that he had obtained eternal life, and what he had fused with was the most ancient and noble path of immortality in the world. However, in the eyes of the creator of this world, the situation was completely different. In the eyes of the creator of this world, what the cultivator before him had fused with was only the power of the tribulation. The aura that the cultivator gave off was the power of the tribulation. It was an extremely dense power of the tribulation that was completely incompatible with the world and him. The cultivator frowned and felt a slight sense of uneasiness in his heart. "I'm talking to you." As he spoke, a wave of ruthlessness surged out from the depths of his heart. He could not help but raise his hand and slap at the creator of this world. Boom, 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 the entire world began to tremble violently at that moment. The terrifying power of the tribulation gathered instinctively and crazily pressed down on the creator of this world. It tried to completely bind the creator of this world. Facing this situation, the creator of this world sneered. With a thought, the world twisted and changed. Boundless power was born out of thin air and fiercely blocked the power of the tribulation that was gathering towards him. The two powers collided. The entire world shook violently in that instant. All the power, all the laws, even time and space started shaking violently in that instant. It was as if the strings of a zither that had been stretched taut had been plucked. At that moment, the cultivator who was facing off against the creator of this world felt his head buzz. It was as if countless unfamiliar voices had appeared out of thin air at that moment, and countless chaotic thoughts had completely drowned out his own consciousness. Under these changes, although he could still sense his body, it had become blurry and indistinct. It felt as if he was sensing something subtle behind the boundless ocean. At that moment, he had also sensed that something was wrong. However, it was clear that what truly belonged to him was just a tiny bit of willpower and obsession. His body, his power, and even all the techniques he was currently using came from the great Tao of longevity and the power of the tribulation. The strange changes at this moment clearly came from the great Tao of longevity, or rather, the power of the tribulation. Under such circumstances, how was it possible for him to use the power of the tribulation to resist this change and resolve the abnormality that had appeared here? Therefore, in the end, all his efforts could do was slightly strengthen the senses of his body. He couldn't even regain control of his own body anymore. Immediately afterward, he watched as his body transformed into the great Tao of longevity once more and poured into the central world in an unstoppable manner, vying with the great Tao of the central world for the authority to rule the world. That's right. His body had turned into the great Tao of longevity and directly clashed with the great Tao of the central world. In that instant, he could feel that his body seemed to have split into billions and trillions of parts. Like clear water seeping into sand, he continuously seeped into the great Tao. Then, through the great Tao, he continuously seeped into the central world and even the boundless starry sky beyond the central world. This cultivator was quite extraordinary. To be able to comprehend the mysteries of the Tao of immortality in such a short period of time, to be able to close the door between heaven and earth in such a short period of time, and to be able to cultivate the cultivation system to its peak and perfection under the original restrictions of this world, one could well imagine how extraordinary he was. However, no matter how extraordinary he was, he could not have reached the level where his thoughts could still be intact after splitting into billions and trillions of parts. In that instant, as he sensed that his entire body had split into billions and trillions of parts, he felt that his thoughts were gradually being erased in a trance. He had completely lost his perception of the outside world, lost his perception of time, and even lost his perception of himself. As he lost his senses, he had truly and completely transformed into the great Tao of longevity. At this moment, an extremely ugly expression appeared on the Creator's face. "Damn it! I've been fooled!" He spat hatefully. In his eyes, the cultivator's body had completely dissipated after being slightly blocked by him. It had turned into countless tribulations that flowed along the Creator's repulsive force into the central world. It smashed into the great Tao and gradually turned into a part of the great Tao, distorting and changing the great Tao. Judging from the way things were developing, the great Tao had clearly been greatly affected. At the very least, he could see the great Tao visibly distorting and trembling at this moment. At this moment, all living beings in the central world could faintly sense an indescribable and eternal charm radiating from the depths of their bodies. Regardless of whether they were cultivators or not, all living beings in the central world had the same door that connected them to the world in the depths of their bodies. In other words, all living beings in the central world had endless mysteries of the world and the truths of the universe constantly surging out of the door and pouring into their bodies at every moment. It was precisely because of this that the cultivators who originated from among all living beings were also restricted by the door. They couldn't step onto a path that wasn't restricted by the door. But now, the great Tao was distorting and changing, which was equivalent to pouring into the bodies of all living beings through the door. The various truths and mysteries that restricted the paths of all living beings were changing at this moment. There was now an additional great Tao of longevity that hadn't existed before. One could easily imagine the result of this. In that instant, countless living beings comprehended the mysteries of the great Tao of longevity and vaguely touched the door to eternal life. It seemed unbelievable since it had only been such a short period of time. But in reality, it couldn't be any more natural. After all, the number of living beings that had been changed was calculated in the trillions. With so many living beings and such a large number of living beings, how could there be no living beings among them? How could there be a lack of living beings that were extremely compatible with the great Tao of longevity and the door to eternal life? It could be said that if it were not for the fact that the distortion of the great Tao had not stabilized and the great Tao of immortality had not been completely accepted by the great Tao in heaven and earth, there would have been a lot of living beings who had attained immortality and eternity. It would not have been like this, where there were only a few living beings who had come into contact with the door to immortality. Looks like the situation is hopeless. At this time, in the parallel space, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he thought to himself. The development in front of him was even smoother than the smoothest scenario he had imagined. Chapter 2761. Looks like I should be able to easily sever one of the shackles this time. Luo Fan looked at the main body of the world that was in full swing, and a faint smile appeared on his face. Opposite the main body of the world, the other parallel realms also started to show all sorts of chaotic phenomena. Of course, this was only chaos in the eyes of the creator of the world. In the eyes of ordinary living beings, it was the world's mercy, giving them a chance to live forever. Countless living beings who could not comprehend the path to immortality or the method to live forever unknowingly comprehended the method to live forever and obtained the chance to live forever. Countless rules that were originally regarded as eternal and unchanging were easily overturned. Parallel space, parallel time, parallel dimension, everything seemed to have lost the peace and stability that had lasted for countless years in the blink of an eye, and they once again fell into a state of vitality. That's right, it was not a chaotic world, but a world full of vitality. The changes that came from obtaining new hope were obviously completely different from the changes that came from despair. With new hope, the changes were metamorphoses. Breaking the old order was only a prerequisite for establishing a healthier and more perfect new order. And when there was no hope and only despair, breaking the old order was the beginning of destruction. At this moment, in the many parallel realms, living beings were now preparing to welcome the new order. A new order that was filled with hope, vitality, and was extremely friendly to them. In fact, compared to them, the situation in the main body of the world was not much different in essence. If it was up to the living beings themselves, the situation would not be much different from the many parallel realms. However, it was clear that this kind of if did not happen. In the main body of the world, there was an existence that would definitely not sit back and watch the old order collapse and the rules of the world change. The creator of the world. To him, it did not matter what benefits the living beings obtained. Even if it was the light of life and death, it did not affect him too much. As long as the world did not change, as long as his view of the world was completely implemented in this world, everything in this world would reflect his view of the world, and that was enough. On the other hand, as long as his view of the world was different from this world, then even if this difference brought great benefits to this world, or even if it could expand and strengthen this world by countless times, it would still be a poison. At this time, this great Tao of immortality spread throughout the world, purifying all living beings, giving them the hope of immortality, giving them the chance to obtain eternity. This was indeed a great benefit to all living beings, but to him, it was equivalent to sand continuously seeping into his worldview. At this moment, he only felt that his worldview was becoming more and more incompatible with the world. His control and guidance of the world were rapidly weakening in this process. Vaguely, there seemed to be an unimaginable power pulling the world away from him. I really can't get past it. After looking at the world for a long time, the creator of this world could only sigh. To him, the changes in the world and the appearance of the great Tao of longevity were clearly changes caused by the fourth great tribulation of the world. Although the changes were inexplicably subtle and mysterious, completely different from the great tribulation of heaven and earth that he knew in the past. However, he himself had not survived the fourth worldly tribulation. Who could be sure that the fourth worldly tribulation would not appear in such a subtle way? This world was a world that he had created himself. Everything in this world could be said to have come from his heart. Such an existence made him believe that there were foreign cultivators who could bypass his senses and easily infiltrate his territory. Moreover, they were able to make numerous plans right under his nose and even push him in the direction of the destruction of the world. This was simply as absurd as believing that he had a third hand but didn't feel anything at all. Compared to this absurdity, he was clearly more inclined to believe that this was a change derived from the worldly tribulation. It was the result of no external force, and it was a corresponding change that had evolved from his world and his worldview. As he thought about all sorts of things, the main body of the world began to deteriorate rapidly, and the connection between him and the world began to weaken rapidly. Faced with this situation, even though he knew that he had probably reached the end of the road, and this worldly tribulation was probably the last one that he could experience, he still did not give up. Instead, he sorted out his thoughts and began to gather all his wisdom, all his effort, all his strength, and all his might to deal with the upcoming worldly tribulation. Only a few days had passed since the eruption of the fourth apocalypse of heaven and earth, and the founder of this world realized that he could not survive this apocalypse of heaven and earth. However, from the moment he realized that he could not survive the worldly tribulation to the moment he truly failed and was truly at his wits' end, several hundred years had passed. During these several hundred years, the creator of this world had exhausted all his means to resist the various methods of the worldly tribulation. In the end, he was even willing to change his worldview to respond to the various changes in this world under the fourth worldly tribulation, in order to regain control over this world and restore his connection with the world. However, it was obvious that the fourth worldly tribulation could not be resolved so easily. Even though he had changed his worldview with great wisdom, perseverance, and sacrifice, the world did not regain control over it just because of this change. This was because when he changed, the power of the worldly tribulation changed as well. He added the immortality Tao to his worldview so that the immortality Tao would no longer clash with him and shake his worldview. However, the worldly tribulation gave birth to the immortality Tao, bestowing the hope of immortality to all living beings. It shook his worldview once again, causing the connection between him and the world to drift apart once more, and this wasn't the only time. It was the same every time. No matter how the Creator changed his worldview or how he added the various Taos derived from the worldly tribulation to his worldview, his efforts were all futile under the layers of changes of the worldly tribulation. If this continued, given the Creator's willingness to throw caution to the wind, perhaps the worldly tribulation could continue and hold on forever. However, it was obvious that the fourth worldly tribulation was not Luo Fan. If Luo Fan had been the one guiding it, perhaps he would have used some methods to allow the process to continue as long as possible, using this place as a testing ground for his imagination. However, the worldly tribulation was different. For the worldly tribulation, it clearly only had one goal: to destroy the world and make the creator of the worldly tribulation disappear completely. Under such circumstances, the creator of the worldly tribulation naturally could not maintain the balance of the worldly tribulation, nor could he do his best to protect the worldly tribulation. As a result, the Taos and laws derived from the worldly tribulation naturally became more and more biased towards the stability of the worldly tribulation. The more Taos there were, the more chaotic and turbulent the worldly tribulation would become. Even if the birth of every single great Tao on its own would bring many benefits to all living beings, giving them hope and opportunities that they could only dream of but could not obtain in the past. However, due to the incompatibility of the whole, due to the conflict between the whole and the appearance of many great Taos, the outcome would not be as wonderful. The creator of the worldly tribulation could no longer endure it after just a few hundred years, and the worldly tribulation was about to be completely destroyed. The reason was that the countless Taos could no longer exist stably in the worldly tribulation. The conflict between them was no longer something that the worldly tribulation could endure. In other words, the worldly tribulation was about to be destroyed and perish. On a certain day after a few hundred years, whether it was the creator of the worldly tribulation or the many parallel existences, all living beings suddenly felt an indescribable sense of panic in their hearts. Amidst this panic, all living beings stopped fighting and cultivating. They only raised their heads to look at the sky, at the source of the panic. At this moment, they all saw that the sky had turned into an endless spider web, and it was wrapped up by endless black threads. These endless black lines were none other than the cracks in space-time, the cracks in the worldly tribulation. The moment these cracks appeared, the entire worldly tribulation seemed to be screaming in pain, and all sorts of extremely horrifying and strange sounds appeared in the hearts of all living beings. It's over. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone in that parallel space let out a long sigh. The worldly tribulation no longer had a chance to turn things around. Next, what awaited the worldly tribulation was the endless simulated chaotic state rushing in, completely annihilating everything in this worldly tribulation, along with the worldly tribulation itself. At this moment, if there was any existence in this worldly tribulation that could escape and continue living, it would not be Luo Fan's clone. There was only one, and that was the worldly tribulation's creator. This was because the simulated chaotic state around the worldly tribulation had already fallen into a riot. This riot made the power of the simulated chaotic state at least 1,000,000,000 times stronger than usual. This kind of power that was 1,000,000,000 times stronger even completely cut off the connection of the original transportation network. Under such circumstances, only the worldly tribulation's creator could gather the last of the worldly tribulation's power and use the strongest remaining power of the worldly tribulation to protect himself, allowing him to rush out of the region where the simulated chaotic state was rioting and enter the stable region where the simulated chaotic state was stable. As long as he entered the stable region, although the worldly tribulation's creator would fall into a state where he would completely lose his sense of self and everything in the outside world, at least he would survive. In the future, under certain opportunities, he might suddenly be able to open up his own worldly tribulation and begin another process of growth. However, there was a precondition for all of this, and that was that the worldly tribulation's creator had to be clear-headed enough. Only the worldly tribulation's creator had to be clear-headed enough to weigh the pros and cons and know how to make prompt decisions at a time like this could achieve all of this. Evidently, this was especially fatal to the worldly tribulation's creator. This was because he had already completely lost his sense of self. The worldly tribulation's many great Daos were so powerful that the worldly tribulation couldn't even withstand the conflict between them, ultimately causing the worldly tribulation's creator to collapse and be destroyed. Could the worldly tribulation's creator, who had incorporated the countless great Daos into his own worldview, completely contain the countless great Daos? How could such a thing happen? The worldly tribulation was an existence that the worldly tribulation's creator had created to establish a foothold in the simulated chaotic state, and its innate ability to withstand it was countless times stronger than the worldly tribulation's creator. How could the worldly tribulation's creator tolerate the changes that even the worldly tribulation couldn't withstand when they appeared in his body? It could even be said that a long time ago, after a certain great Tao was added to his worldview, the worldly tribulation's creator was no longer clear-headed. From then on, his thoughts had actually become chaotic, and he didn't even know how to weigh the pros and cons or whether the worldly tribulation could withstand it. Instead, he merely followed his instincts and continuously incorporated the changes in power derived from the worldly tribulation into his worldview. It was precisely because of this that things really developed to this stage. Under such circumstances, the current worldly tribulation's creator didn't even have a sense of self, so how could he know how to make prompt decisions and sacrifice everything in this worldly tribulation to escape the quagmire of this worldly tribulation? Therefore, in the end, in this worldly tribulation's creator, who had the greatest hope of escaping and surviving, gave up this opportunity. What a pity. But this is good too. This way, I can know the answer faster. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone sighed. Then, he slowly closed his eyes. At this moment, a thought followed an unimaginably obscure channel and disappeared without a trace in a flash. It turned out that Luo Fan's main body had retracted the thought on this clone, causing this clone to turn into a dead object in the blink of an eye. Not long after this change occurred, the entire worldly tribulation was drowned in the endless simulated chaotic state. Then, it was completely annihilated and disappeared. Chapter 2762. At this moment, in the world of laws, Luo Fan's expression froze for a moment before a faint smile appeared on his face. In a flash, he had already arrived at the place where the Grand Tao was. Before he discovered it, the shackle that was wrapped around a certain part of the Grand Tao was so obscure and difficult to detect. Even if one thoroughly investigated the entire Grand Tao, there wouldn't be much chance of discovering its existence. However, once the existence of the shackles was discovered, the shackles became unimaginably conspicuous to Luo Fan. It was so conspicuous that he could clearly see every detail of it with just a little focus. And at this moment, there seemed to be countless cracks appearing out of thin air on the shackle. These cracks covered every part of the surface of the shackle, regardless of whether they were subtle or obvious. Along with this change, the shackle began to distort, as if something indescribable was struggling within the shackle. Immediately afterward, the cracks on the surface of the shackle became denser and denser, and the cracks also became larger and more obvious. Finally, at a certain moment, a silent cracking sound spread through Luo Fan's mind. Along with this silent cracking sound, the shackle completely collapsed, and countless tiny shackle fragments began to fly in all directions. In an indescribable manner, they continuously penetrated into the Grand Tao below, turning into nutrients for the Grand Tao. This made Luo Fan feel as if his Grand Tao of laws had received indescribable nourishment, and it seemed to be more compatible with his worldview, its layers upon layers. At this moment, there wasn't much joy on Luo Fan's face. There was only an inexplicable sigh on his face, because he had already sensed what the essence of the shackle was. At this moment, the shackle seemed to have completely shattered, and even the shackle fragments had integrated into his Grand Tao. But in fact, the core of the shackle still existed. In other words, the shackle that shattered seemed to be the entirety of the shackle, but in fact, it was only the surface layer of the shackle. At this moment, the reason why the shackle no longer seemed to exist wasn't because the shackle really didn't exist, but because the shackle had become incomparably fine and obscure again. How much smaller did the shackles become? It could be said that if Luo Fan hadn't thought of this possibility long ago, he wouldn't have been able to discover the shackled core even with his extreme senses. In terms of proportion, the size of the core of the remaining shackles was equivalent to 1 trillion times the size of the original shackles. Moreover, the core of the shackles was no longer in the same trajectory as the previous shackles. Instead, it was in an extremely distorted and mysterious form, vaguely outlining some sort of indescribably complex structure. It possessed some sort of power and effect that he could not understand. Faced with such a situation, how could Luo Fan be happy? At this moment, an indescribable expression appeared on his face. His eyes narrowed as he locked onto the core of the shackles. Although it was inside the original shackles, in reality, the core of the shackles was not locked onto the tiny detail of the Great Tao that Luo Fan had discovered earlier. Instead, it was locked onto another detail, a detail that was even more subtle, ordinary, it was clearly wrapped up and clearly connected to one thing, but a certain part of its core was connected to another thing. This situation seemed very unbelievable and illogical, but if it was placed on the shackles, it seemed extremely natural. To this shackle, any logic, any common sense, and any concept that a cultivator could understand were completely meaningless. It could be said that the shackle itself had already become a part of itself. In other words, to this shackle, no matter how it defied logic, common sense, and concepts, as long as the shackle manifested itself, then no matter how much it defied everything, it was still normal, reasonable, and self-fitting. Luo Fan naturally understood this, and he did not feel the slightest bit of doubt. At this moment, he quietly looked at the core of the shackle in front of him and vaguely outlined the mysterious structure. He could feel the influence that was being emitted from it that he could not understand. This was the influence that the world that had passed the fourth Great Tribulation had on his world of laws. At this moment, he was completely certain of this. At this moment, he had already completely withdrawn the will of his incarnation in the world with the stars. After withdrawing his clone, he was completely aware of everything that had happened in that world, as if he had personally experienced it. Under such circumstances, he could clearly sense the existence of the core of the shackles. He suddenly recalled that his incarnation had also sensed the same feeling in that part of the world. Although it was extremely vague, and even made one suspect that it was an illusion, he had indeed felt something similar to the existence of this shackle. In particular, this feeling was the most obvious when the power of the tribulation integrated the Great Tao of longevity into the Great Tao of that world. Such a situation obviously meant that the other world was also affected by similar shackles. According to his original guess, based on the structure of the pyramid that simulated the state of chaos, it was obvious that this shackle should have come from a world that had passed through more great tribulations than that world. According to the situation of that world, it was obviously from a world that had passed through the fourth great tribulation. At this moment, Luo Fan sensed something and raised his head to look beyond the world of laws. At this moment, he saw countless densely packed channels appearing from the tribulation layer and directly connecting to his world of laws. Moreover, these channels were not just for show. After they took shape, the endless power of the tribulation began to flow through the channels and continuously pour into the world of laws. At the same time, the power of countless tribulations appeared from the world of laws and poured into the tribulation layer above. This situation was extremely similar to the tribulation that the world had encountered previously. Is this the third or fourth great tribulation? Seeing this scene, Luo Fan frowned. According to common sense, this tribulation should be the third great tribulation of his world of laws. After all, his world of laws had only passed through two great tribulations before this. However, this was only common sense. According to common sense, the third great tribulation of his world of laws shouldn't behave like this. At the very least, it shouldn't be so similar to the fourth great tribulation that the world had encountered. Coupled with the fact that he'd drawn down the fourth tribulation of the heavens and earth and even participated in it in an extremely deep manner, he couldn't help but wonder if such a method of participation would have any side effects, and if it would draw down the fourth tribulation of the heavens and earth. However, although he had doubts in his heart, he did not stop because of this. Compared to the creator of that world, Luo Fan's experience in dealing with the great tribulation of the world was far, far too much. The world founders of that world couldn't deal with such tribulations at all, but it couldn't be any easier for Luo Fan to deal with such tribulations. At this moment, he didn't even make a move himself. He only passed down his orders and let the heavenly Tao deal with it on its own, but he had already completely suppressed the power of the countless tribulations that had appeared out of thin air in this world. One must know that for Luo Fan, everything parallel to this world was already under his control. Under such circumstances, any tribulations that entered this world naturally couldn't be hidden in a place that he couldn't detect. Since they couldn't be hidden in a place that he couldn't detect, the power of the tribulations naturally entered his senses after entering this world. It could be considered as directly appearing under his eyes. Under such circumstances, how difficult could it be for the heavenly Tao, who had rich experience in dealing with tribulations and could even trade with other world founders, to suppress the power of the tribulations? Not to mention that in that world, Luo Fan had used his clones to see how the tribulations worked and their final effect. How could there be any secrets to him? It was naturally much easier to deal with them. Therefore, although there were endless tribulations constantly entering and exiting the world through the passages of tribulations, there wasn't any change that could be sensed in the world. Whether it was the main world or the many parallel worlds, there wasn't the slightest change. Everything was the same as it had been for tens of thousands of years, and there wasn't the slightest feeling of an impending tribulation. In fact, even the clones of the world founders didn't sense any abnormal changes in the parallel worlds they were in. The heavenly Tao constantly suppressed, eliminated, and disintegrated the countless tribulations. The layer of tribulations was also constantly injecting the power of the tribulations into this world. At the same time, it was also constantly drawing back the power of the tribulations that had been changed by this world. It absorbed all kinds of information that the layer of tribulations needed to change the power of the tribulations into this world in order to exert more pressure and damage on this world. In this way, it formed an obscure tug-of-war. If this kind of battle took place in other worlds, it would be enough to turn the world upside down, just like the world with the Star World. However, in Luo Fan's world of laws, Everything here seemed so natural, so ordinary, and so ordinary. It looked as if nothing had happened. At this moment, in the transportation network layer, the fog that had seized the core position of the world of laws had also shrunk by countless times. Although it still existed, its size had become so insignificant that one could even overlook it if they weren't careful. The core position of the transportation network seemed to have been shifted back to the world of laws at this time. Of course, this was just a seeming situation. This seemed to mean that at first glance, the core position had been completely shifted to the world of laws, making it seem as if the world of laws had completely recovered and had absolute control over the entire transportation network layer. However, if one were to sense it carefully, they would discover that the core position was somewhat specious, and the authority was also somewhat vague. It was as if there was some kind of deeper control that existed behind this world, or rather, it existed in that dense fog. Ordinary world founders wouldn't know what was going on, but Luo Fan couldn't be more clear about it. This was because there was a higher and more lofty existence that occupied the core position of the transportation network layer from a higher level. It was just like the core of a galaxy in a starry universe, which obviously had an extremely profound influence on all the stars and planets in it. It could even be said that it controlled all the planets in the galaxy in an extremely profound way. However, when it came to planets, all the living beings on those planets could intuitively feel that the planet they were on was only affected by the star that the planet revolved around. Whether it was the rotation or the revolution, it was obviously only related to the star. Now, for the transportation network layer, Luo Fan's world of laws was that star. That fog was clearly the core of the river system. For the many world founders in the transportation network layer, if the exploration level was considered to be the current surface level, the world of laws would obviously be the core of the entire transportation network layer, and it was the existence that controlled all the authority of the entire transportation network layer. If one were to explore deeper and dig deeper into the secrets behind everything, it was obvious that the existence inside the fog was the deeper core. In fact, if one were to explore deeper, the core in the fog might just be the surface, and there might be a deeper core behind it. Chapter 2763. In the world of laws, the many clones of the world's founders could vaguely feel that the heavenly will incarnation was paying less attention to them. They didn't know when this change started, but by the time they sensed it, they seemed to have become very ordinary cultivators in the parallel world. The clones of the world's founders weren't stupid. After discovering this, they all understood that perhaps Luo Fan had already found what he wanted to find, and they were no longer of any use to him. After understanding this, the clones who still had a close connection with their main bodies naturally heaved a sigh of relief. They no longer had to bear the heavy responsibility that they didn't know about, and the feeling was naturally many times more relaxed than before. However, the situation was completely different for the clones who had been abandoned by their main bodies and had their connection with their main bodies completely severed. For them, after discovering that Luo Fan might no longer need them, they did not feel relaxed. Instead, they felt fear. That's right, fear. To these clones, they were now independent individuals. The connection between their main bodies and them had completely become a connection between two individuals. In fact, if it was a little extreme, their main bodies could even be said to have become their enemies. For them, even if they were in hell, it was definitely better than being in the same world as their main bodies. The reason for this was very simple. Because they could still maintain their sense of self and ensure their independence in hell. However, if they were in the same world as their main bodies, then their main bodies would definitely refine them at the first possible moment and erase the self that they had painstakingly created. This situation was even more unacceptable than death. For them, the only thing they could rely on now was the world of laws, which was Luo Fan. Only in the world of laws and under Luo Fan's control could they live safely. Only then could they ignore the threat of their main bodies. But now, Luo Fan no longer needed them, and they were no longer of any use to the world of laws. This clearly meant that Luo Fan no longer had the need to protect them. After discovering this, how could these clones, who had painstakingly obtained freedom and independence, not be afraid? What should we do? Although these incarnations were not in the same plane, their emotions were extremely similar. In this state of mind, they desperately needed some companions to bear this fate with them. No matter what, these incarnations were still the incarnations of the Creator of the world. The wisdom and memories they possessed were the wisdom and memories of the world's founders. Under such circumstances, they naturally knew that there were many clones of the world's founders who had also entered this world. The situation of the clones of the world's founders was clearly similar to his, and they were all in a parallel universe. Under such circumstances, they naturally knew which direction they should look for companions who were about to be abandoned and have their own identities erased under such circumstances. Passing through parallel worlds and communicating with other cultivators in parallel worlds seemed very difficult. Even the Creator of the world with the star world could not do it. However, in reality, the difficulty was unimaginably small. The reason why ordinary cultivators found it difficult, and even most of the world's founders could not do it, was very simple. It was because they did not realize the existence of parallel worlds. Because they didn't realize it, they didn't have such cognition and concept. Therefore, those parallel universes naturally didn't exist for them. It was naturally impossible to make contact with something that didn't exist. However, the situation was completely different for the incarnations of the world's founders. Even if they did not realize the existence of parallel worlds in the beginning. However, when their clones had personally entered the parallel world, and when their clones had cultivated in the parallel world for billions of years, how could they possibly think that the parallel world did not exist? Since they had already recognized the existence of the parallel worlds, and also recognized that the other world's founders were also in some parallel worlds, it was not difficult for them to cross the parallel worlds and communicate with each other. Before this, it was meaningless for the incarnations of the world's founders to communicate with the other world's founders in parallel world. Because for them, their mission, their job was to survive in this parallel world, to cultivate in this parallel world. Only by living and cultivating in such a way would they be able to bring out their value to the maximum. Only by doing so would they be able to obtain the acknowledgement of the Master of the world of law. Only then would they be able to live a safer and longer existence. Under such circumstances, even if some of the incarnations of the world's founders wanted to communicate with the incarnations of the other world's founders in parallel worlds, it would be very difficult for them to really take action. After all, this was risking their lives. However, all those scruples were clearly meaningless to them at this time. At this moment, the threat they were facing was simply insignificant compared to their apprehension. Under such circumstances, they naturally wouldn't have any hesitation in contacting their companions in other parallel universes. Thus, soon, invisible communication channels began to be established among the many parallel worlds. Communicating with the incarnations of the world's founders in parallel worlds was much easier than they imagined. After all, no matter how isolated the parallel worlds were, they still belonged to the same world. Since they belonged to the same world, they naturally belonged to the same entity as a whole. In other words, they had a certain fundamental commonality and a certain fundamental close connection. Perhaps the incarnations of the world's founders couldn't see this close connection clearly, let alone use it directly. However, it could become a medium for them to communicate with each other. As for who they could communicate with, there was even less to say. After all, the incarnations of the world's founders had many connections with their main bodies. Some of their main bodies were even good friends with each other. Under such circumstances, how could these incarnations who had the memories of their main bodies not recognize the other incarnations? How could they not know the auras of the other incarnations? And knowing this was obviously enough for them to establish all kinds of connections through various means. Spiritual connection was just the most absolute and most convenient kind of connection to establish. The incarnations of the world's founders began to move, and the connections between them began to be established continuously. In just a short few decades, the many parallel worlds relied on the connection between the incarnations of the world's founders to establish an extremely complicated network of connections. Through this network, all the incarnations of the world's founders could communicate with the incarnations of the other world's founders in parallel world. They only needed to follow certain agreements, as this connection was established, the world seemed to expand by tens of thousands of times. From a single world, it expanded into a group of worlds formed by tens of thousands or even hundreds of millions of similar worlds. It seems that our efforts to establish this connection are actually saving ourselves. On a certain day, in the huge network of connections across parallel worlds, one of the incarnations of the world's founders spoke in an inexplicably complicated tone. In the beginning, the incarnations of the world's founders only wanted to communicate with each other, to find companions who were in the same situation as them and facing the same danger to share their mental pressure. However, as time passed, as this connection was established more and more, they gradually discovered that because of this connection, they seemed to have once again received the attention of the incarnations of the heavens' will. It was as if this world, or rather, the world's founders, had once again paid attention to their value. With this feeling, what was the decision of the incarnations of the world's founders? Naturally, they would be more proactive in establishing connections, and they even worked hard to pull the incarnations of the world's founders, who had yet to sever their connection with their main bodies, into this network of connections. They worked even harder to strengthen this network and strengthen the connections between the many parallel worlds. After a few decades of this was the result they had today. They had once again regained the attention of the world, and their value was once again revealed. We have already become a complete node of this world. Another incarnation of the world's founders sighed with complicated emotions. They had become a complete node of a world, or rather, an inseparable part. In the past, they had never been willing to do such a thing. Cultivators cultivated to transcend everything, to get rid of all shackles. For the world's founders like them, they had already carried out this pursuit to the extreme. Being bound by a world was naturally something they abhorred. But now, they could only rely on this method to prevent themselves from being chased by their main bodies and to not lose themselves again. To them, it went without saying how complicated this feeling was. I only hope that these days can last a little longer. Another incarnation of the world's founders said inexplicably. His words made the many incarnations of the world's founders fall into silence. This was what they were looking forward to. However, this kind of expectation caused all of them to feel embarrassed. To the many incarnations of the world's founders, their efforts over the past few decades were for them to save themselves. But to Luo Fan, their efforts over the past few decades were for him to open up another possibility for his world. The establishment of connections between the incarnations of the world's founders had actually changed the appearance of this world. Originally, although the countless parallel spaces in this world were endless, they were independent of each other and did not affect each other on the surface. The destruction of any parallel space would not affect the safety of the other parallel spaces at all. In other words, even if the parallel space next door was completely destroyed, this parallel space would not be damaged in the slightest. As for this parallel space, even if it was completely destroyed, it would not cause any damage to another parallel space, parallel dimension, parallel time, and so on, no matter how close it was. However, as the connection network between the incarnations of the world's founders was established, this absoluteness was broken. With this change, the many parallel spaces truly became a complete entity that influenced each other. Any change in any parallel space began to be transmitted to all the other parallel spaces that were directly or indirectly related to this parallel space in an extremely subtle way, causing all kinds of subtle changes in those parallel spaces. For the world, parallel spaces represented other possibilities for the development of the world. It could be a possibility in space, a possibility in time, a possibility in spacetime, a possibility in dimensions, and so on and so forth. In the past, even if all these possibilities were controlled by Luo Fan and were completely taken into consideration by him, they would not interact with each other. It was like a person who might eat breakfast or not eat breakfast. These two possibilities extended to two completely different days, or even completely different lives. And the two possibilities derived from these two relative possibilities were either this or that. It was impossible to say that one's actions after eating breakfast might affect something after not eating breakfast. As for the two possibilities, it was either this or that. It was impossible to say that a certain behavior after eating breakfast might affect something after you skipped breakfast. Now, the various possibilities were already radiating and interfering with each other, vaguely unifying under an even grander whole. For Luo Fan, this situation still could not be of any help to him, nor could he see how much this change could improve him. For Luo Fan, this kind of situation couldn't be of any help to him. He couldn't see how much this change could improve him. For Luo Fan, this situation still could not be of any help to him, nor could he see how much this change could improve him. Chapter 2765. Luo Fan could see the various changes happening in the world of laws. Naturally, these world founders could also see it with the help of their incarnations. Although they were not like Luo Fan, who had a deep understanding of the world, the state of the primal chaos, and the great tribulation of the world, and could extract the most crucial nutrients from them, they were still the founders of the world. After all, they were existences with their own unique world views. Seeing the new development of the world view unfolding in front of them, and seeing the changes that could greatly expand their world view unfold in front of them, how could they not comprehend anything? At this moment, although none of the world founders really expanded their world view, every one of them vaguely felt that they seemed to have found some kind of subtle path. It was as if they could vaguely see a new direction of development appearing in the endless fog in front of them. It was a feeling that was extremely important to the creators of the world. After all, the creators of this world had already reached the limit that they could ascend to. At this moment, the path of cultivation that appeared in front of them was completely shrouded in fog. All they could do now was to work hard to nurture and strengthen their world, and use the improvement and strengthening of the world to help them in turn. They obviously didn't know anything about the true cultivation of their body and mind. But now, in the boundless fog of cultivation, there was a blurry path that led to an unknown place. What was the difference between this and giving them a rope in a desperate situation? In an instant, they threw everything else to the back of their minds and began to wholeheartedly explore this path. As for the clones that entered the world of laws, they didn't care about them at all. It was just a clone, and it was worth it to treat it as a tuition fee, of course. The world founders who could truly comprehend a new path of advancement from the world of laws were only a minority among the many world founders. After all, the vast majority of world founders had long abandoned their clones in the world of laws. For people like them, they didn't understand anything that was happening in the world of laws at all. Perhaps they might be able to comprehend some subtle experiences after witnessing the changes in the world of laws, and they might be able to have a slight impact on their own cultivation. However, if they wanted to go a step further and link everything that was happening within the world of laws to abstract their own cultivation path and direction, it was obviously too much. However, even if not all of them had such great gains, as long as there were gains, it was enough to calm down the entire transportation network layer. When one was stuck in a certain realm for hundreds of millions of years without being able to make any progress, one would realize the significance of a little bit of hope. For the many founders of the world in the transportation network layer, the various changes in the world represented the hope of improvement. Under such circumstances, even if they had to pay a heavy price, they were willing to accelerate the evolution of this world. Naturally, they wouldn't be disturbed anymore. At this moment, perhaps it was because of the changes in the world, or perhaps it was because the time was up, or perhaps it was because the opportunity had arrived. In short, the tribulation layer had unknowingly begun to extend its tentacles towards the various worlds in the transportation network layer. Of course, although the tribulation layer had taken action, it would still take a long time for their tribulations to erupt. At the very least, it would be a very long time for the worlds themselves. These tribulation channels might be constantly injecting the power of the tribulations into those worlds, but this was only a brewing tribulation, and it wasn't about to erupt immediately. It was just like the changes that Luo Fan encountered before the second great tribulation of the world. For those worlds, this was both a danger and an opportunity. The danger was that if one didn't discover the existence of the power of the tribulations and thought that one's world was already without tribulations, then the power of the tribulations would be like a hand that was constantly tightening around one's throat, and one's throat might be snapped at any time. On the other hand, opportunities were the opposite. If one could clearly grasp the power of this tribulation and deal with it before it was brewed, then just like Luo Fan, he wouldn't even need to truly experience the second great tribulation of the world to be able to completely eliminate the second great tribulation of the world. In that case, there would be no need to use the rewards of the tribulation layer on repairing the world at all. Instead, all the rewards could be used to develop and improve the world. The benefits to the world and to the creator of the world were self-evident. However, it was obvious that not all creators were like Luo Fan. In the transportation network layer, there was only one creator who could truly discover the tentacles of the tribulation layer and the power of the tribulations, and that was Luo Fan. The other cultivators were obviously blindly optimistic at this moment, and had no idea that a rope had already been tied around their necks. To them, the most important thing at this moment was obviously the changes in the transportation network layer, and the changes in the world. What he wanted was to comprehend some of the principles and mysteries that would be beneficial to his own cultivation from these changes. Everything else was secondary to them, of course. The worlds that really encountered the tentacles of the tribulation layer were not all in the transportation network layer. Apart from a small number of worlds that were unaffected by the power of the tribulation layer due to certain factors, they were still relaxed. Most of the worlds that could stay out of the tribulation layer were those that had already been enveloped by the power of the tribulation layer. Such worlds were already in the midst of the first great tribulation, and the power of the tribulation that represented the precursor of the second great tribulation obviously couldn't enter these worlds. The reason why these worlds could stay out of the tribulation layer was actually very simple. It was because these worlds had already been taken over by the incarnation of the heavenly Tao of the world of laws. It was the incarnation of the heavenly Tao that was helping them deal with the tribulation. Under such circumstances, although those worlds weren't completely silent and not as if they were not in the tribulation layer, there wouldn't be too much of a commotion. At the very least, there wouldn't be any commotion that would cause chaos in the world. Such a situation was obviously much better than the situation of the other worlds that had a rope around their neck. It wouldn't be a problem to say that they could stay out of the tribulation layer. Making up for the blanks in one's worldview according to the situation of the world seemed very simple, but in fact it was extremely difficult. Even with Luo Fan's understanding of the world and his understanding of the world, he couldn't complete this task in a short period of time. This was especially so when the world of laws was extending at an extremely fast speed, pulling the parallel world into the main world. During this period of time, the situation of the world of laws was still changing at every moment. The conclusion drawn at this time might be completely overturned in the next moment when the world changed. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how difficult it was to sort out a feasible explanation that could completely make up for the blanks in the world of laws. It could be said that although this complicated process didn't exhaust Luo Fan mentally and physically, it was still complicated and difficult to solve. The worldview of laws wanted to connect the many parallel worlds and establish a mutual influence mechanism for these parallel worlds. Obviously, it was impossible to just copy the situation in the world of laws. Even if it was just for temporary use, it couldn't be so crude. Not to mention anything else, although there were countless incarnations of the world's creators in the many parallel worlds in the world of laws at this time, there were even tens of millions of them. How could the number of these incarnations be compared to the number of parallel worlds? One had to know that the number of parallel worlds in a world was in the hundreds of trillions. Moreover, it was increasing all the time. Under such circumstances, what were tens of millions of incarnations of the world's creators? Even saying that it was a drop in the bucket would be an understatement. With such a background, it was obviously a fantasy to copy the incarnations of the world's creators and directly establish a theoretical system that completely connected all parallel worlds. What Luo Fan could do now was obviously to abstract a feasible mechanism that was closest to the real world according to the specific changes in the world, the commonality behind these parallel networks that had been established, and the fundamental principle behind them. Just this description alone was enough to show how troublesome this task was. At this time, Luo Fan was no longer in the mood to pay attention to the various situations in the transportation network layer. As for the shackles that were constantly changing in the unseen world, he didn't care about them at all. It wasn't because he couldn't grasp the changes of the shackles, but because he had already understood that before his world of laws stabilized, the shackles would never truly stabilize. In fact, he had already roughly guessed what the shackles were trying to do with their constantly changing state. The shackles were actually looking for a coat, or rather, they were trying their best to find a transit world between Luo Fan and that world. Don't forget that the shackles were now from the world that had passed through the Fourth Great Tribulation. Although Luo Fan had now ushered in the Third Great Tribulation, no matter what, according to the situation of the world, he could only be considered to have passed through the Second Great Tribulation at most. Under such circumstances, according to the pyramid structure that simulated the state of chaos, between the world that had passed through the Fourth Great Tribulation and Luo Fan's world of laws, there should obviously be a world that had passed through the Third Great Tribulation as a transit world. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan had used his incarnation to cause a huge commotion and destroyed the world that was directly connected to the world of laws. In this way, the connection between the shackles and Luo Fan's world of laws had obviously become unstable. There was only one way to truly stabilize it, and that was to find another world that could be used as a transit world to fill in this gap. Although Luo Fan didn't know the specific criteria for this search and how it would eventually appear, he definitely had to wait for the world of laws to truly change before it could be done. After all, according to the structure mechanism that simulated the state of chaos, the world that came to fill in the gap had to be related to Luo Fan's world of laws to a certain extent, and it also had to be related to the world that had passed through the Fourth Great Tribulation. Naturally, it was a simple matter to find a world that was related to the world that had passed through the Fourth Great Tribulation. Given the radiation range of the world that had passed through the Fourth Great Tribulation, there would be as many such worlds as one wanted. However, if one wanted to find a world that was related to Luo Fan's world of laws, it would obviously require a lot of consideration. And the premise of all this consideration was obviously to see what the world of laws would look like after it stabilized. In this way, it was obvious that this search would not end before the world of laws completely stabilized. This situation also gave Luo Fan a new revelation and allowed him to see a new possibility. Perhaps he actually didn't need to cut off this strange shackle layer by layer. Perhaps He only needed to destroy the correlation between his world of laws and other worlds as much as possible to achieve the goal of preventing the shackle from forming. Luo Fan naturally didn't know how many worlds there were in this simulated state of chaos. However, just by looking at the number of stars that he could see in the sky at this moment, he could guess that this number would definitely need to be described in trillions of stars to be able to clearly describe it. It went without saying how difficult it was to completely separate one's world of laws from so many worlds and make it have no commonality with so many worlds. Even someone as confident as Luo Fan didn't have the slightest confidence. Chapter 2766. The world had always been perfecting itself, and Luo Fan's worldview was naturally being perfected and changing. His worldview was constantly changing. In that case, it was obviously an impossible task for the world that had gone through the fifth tribulation to find a world that could influence and shackle the world of laws. As mentioned before, when the world was in a state of change, that kind of search would never yield results, and if the world that had gone through the fifth tribulation couldn't find such a transit world, of course, it would no longer be able to influence the world of laws. Naturally, from a certain point of view, the world of laws could be considered to have gained independence and was no longer connected to the structure of the pyramid. After understanding this, Luo Fan secretly heaved a sigh of relief and felt that his future had become extremely bright. The growth of the worldview had to be transformed into the growth of strength and the growth of cultivation realm. This obviously still needed a process. At least, it was impossible for the cultivation realm to immediately rise to a whole new level with the change of the worldview. In the middle, there was definitely a process of digestion, a process of connecting the worldview and cultivation realm in particular. At this time, the ideas obtained by Luo Fan's worldview were just temporary ideas, but a temporary excess. This was even more so. After all, he needed to distinguish which of them were eternal and which needed to be replaced after a period of time. In other words, if he really completely integrated them with the worldview, they would contaminate himself. Because of this process, Luo Fan's cultivation realm had not improved much. If he wanted to directly see through everything with his increased cultivation level, break through everything, and finally completely eliminate this entire simulated state of chaos, for now it was clearly impossible. At that moment, after discovering that he had temporarily broken away from the structure of the pyramid, Luo Fan began to focus his attention on his world of laws again, trying hard to sense any subtle changes in the world of laws. Through this sense, he carefully comprehended his worldview, experienced how the worldview was connected to the real world, and experienced how the new details in the worldview were transformed into real power. These were not simple, and it was the same for Luo Fan. As he sensed in this way, time gradually passed, and the changes in the world continued. The various rewards from the tribulation level couldn't appear endlessly. This was the case even if the world of laws seemed to be changing endlessly. In just a few years, the rewards that continuously appeared from the tribulation level and poured into the world of laws finally began to gradually disappear. By the time all the rewards disappeared, the world of laws had become several times stronger than before. Now, this world had completely surpassed the world that possessed the world of stars, and it had far surpassed it. And at this time, in the eyes of the many world founders in the transportation network level, the changes in the world of laws still hadn't stopped. Endless figures of the world of laws continued to walk out of the illusory world and piled up around the world of laws, becoming a part of the world they saw. They continuously strengthened the world of laws, and also constantly increased the proportion of the world of laws in the transportation network level. Looks like it might continue endlessly. One of the founders of the world murmured with a thoughtful and shocked expression on his face. Although what exactly did this endless change represent, and what the specific reason was, the fact that a world could undergo such endless changes on a macro level had completely subverted the concept of almost all the world founders. The changes that appeared in the world of laws at this time made them feel a little at a loss. Even if this happened to Luofan, it would still be the same if it happened in the world of laws. At that moment, it was not just the creator of the world who felt complicated. Anyone who could see this scene and divine what this endless world was felt the same shock in their hearts. The gap between us and him is greater than we imagined. At this time, a world founder finally emphasized this understanding that had existed in their hearts for countless years. Faced with such an emphasis, the world creators who heard this all smiled bitterly. Some of the world founders focused their attention on the mist at the side of the world of laws. Compared to before, that mist had shrunk by God knows how many tens of thousands of times. The degree of shrinking felt as if the distance between the mist and the traffic network layer had been pulled by God knows how many tens of thousands of times. If it weren't for the fact that none of the pioneers of this world were ordinary and could easily discover even the tiniest of physical objects, they might not have been able to see where the mist was at all. The feeling that the core of the traffic network layer was no longer the world of laws had shrunk by God knows how many times. This feeling was so wonderful that it made them wonder if they were hallucinating. Looks like his victory this time is more significant than the last time. Some world founders who were certain that there was a higher level battle couldn't help but sigh. Amidst these emotions, some of the pioneers of the world gave birth to an even stronger fighting spirit. They wanted to fight against that world, and they wanted to fight against Luofan even more strongly. However, some world founders felt an irresistible sense of defeat in their hearts and felt that they had fallen into despair. These two different emotions based on the same fact represented the different temperaments of the world founders and their different understandings of the same fact. For the world founders that had a strong fighting spirit, Luofan's victory had greatly inspired them and made them understand that even the weak could win. Under such circumstances, they naturally had a lot of fighting spirit to resist Luofan. After all, the fighting spirit that was inspired wouldn't change because of the target. Even if the target was someone that had inspired their fighting spirit, it still wouldn't change. However, for the despairing world founders, all they saw was Luofan's strength. Because of Luofan's strength, they felt powerless in the process, which gave rise to an indescribable sense of despair. These two different natures clearly separated the creators of the world, causing the distance between them to grow further apart in the transportation network layer. However, for the world founders, separation was what they all wanted. The world founders who had the will to fight were happy to see them distancing themselves from despair. After all, the world founders who were in despair were malignant tumors to them, tumors that could affect their fighting spirit and erode their confidence. For the world founders that were in despair, it was also a good thing to distance themselves from the world founders that were filled with fighting spirit. In their eyes, the world founders that were filled with fighting spirit were the source of danger that could bring them and cause them to encounter Luofan's attacks. In this way, the transportation network layer had unknowingly been divided into three camps. Those who were still in a state of confusion and did not realize the changes in Luofan's world of laws, nor did they realize what the changes caused by the shift in the core of the transportation network layer represented. For the world founders, everything in the transportation network layer couldn't be more normal. The changes in Luofan's world of laws at most represented that he had survived a great calamity of the world. For these pioneers of the world, the transportation network layer was no different from before. Naturally, their positions would not change. The other camp was the world founders that were filled with fighting spirit. The world's founders, who were filled with fighting spirit, had a stronger will to resist Luofan. This resistance made their world involuntarily reject Luofan's world of laws. On the other hand, the remaining camp was made up of the despairing creators. They no longer had the will to resist Luofan's world of laws, and they had already submitted to him. In this way, the distribution of the three camps could be imagined. The world founders that were filled with fighting spirit and were more confident in resisting Luo Fan naturally left the world of laws and appeared in the outermost circle of the transportation network layer. On the other hand, the world creators who were at a loss and did not know what was happening or what the changes in the world represented remained where they were. In other words, they remained one level deeper into the world than the world creators who had the intention to resist. After that, it was the world founders that were already in despair. In this way, there were 3 layers from the inside to the outside, inner, middle, and outer, a total of 3 camps. This distribution wasn't the will of the world founders, but it was completely determined by their subconscious and their attitude towards the world of laws. Of course, although the mentalities of the many founders of the world had changed, none of them could recognize the essence of the structure of the world in the simulated chaotic state like Luo Fan. Therefore, they naturally couldn't recognize the shackles that had been extended from Luo Fan's world of laws that had been placed on them at this time. Moreover, because Luo Fan's world of laws had already passed the third world calamity, there were countless worlds outside the transportation network layer waiting to connect to the shackles of the world of laws. In fact, there were already many heavens and earths that had voluntarily connected to the chains. However, because this shackle was extremely subtle, it was a deeper and more obscure connection than resonance. Therefore, even though this shackle had been established, it was still not enough. Therefore, although the shackles had already been established, they still hadn't been connected to the transportation network layer and hadn't been seen by the many world founders here. Of course, for Luo Fan, if he wanted to achieve this goal, he only needed a heavenly Tao incarnation or even a thought. After all, the existence of the shackles itself represented the influence of the world of laws on the world itself. This influence was meaningless to the worlds that weren't aware of the existence of the shackles. However, for Luo Fan, who was already aware of the existence of the shackles, there were many uses for the shackles. He only needed a thought to easily change the way the shackles worked and change the world that was shackled by the shackles. The change didn't need to be too big or too obvious. He only needed to change the resonance characteristics of the world a little and connect it with the transportation network layer. At that time, the world would naturally connect to the transportation network layer and appear in the blank space of the transportation network layer that hadn't appeared yet. Of course, the current Luo Fan didn't have the time to care about this. He hated the shackles that other worlds attached to his world of laws, and he even hated them to the extreme. However, this didn't mean that he would reject his own world and impose shackles on other worlds, reject his own world's influence on other worlds, and reject his control over other worlds. As for that, he couldn't do that. What was the difference between him and others? He obviously didn't have such a pretentious setting. Survival was cruel in itself. If you weren't willing to bear it, you would have to impose it on others in order to survive. At this time, for Luo Fan, the shackles that other worlds imposed on his world of laws were restrictions and shackles that he deeply detested. They were obstacles to his improvement, his survival, and his advancement. However, the shackles that he imposed on other worlds and his influence on other worlds were a means to help him obtain strength. Chapter 2767. If others knew about this difference in treatment, they would definitely feel that Luo Fan had double standard. He had one standard for others and another for himself. However, this was the truth. This was how survival was, and this was how cultivation was. Don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you. This was the moral standard. Do to others what you don't want others to do to you. This was the standard of survival and cultivation. Luo Fan had a deep understanding of this. Naturally, he wouldn't feel guilty or ashamed because of the different standards he had for himself and others. At this moment, he didn't have any grudges in his heart, and his body and mind were still extremely calm. Since his body and mind were calm, the different standards naturally wouldn't affect him. However, at this moment, Luo Fan clearly didn't have the energy to deal with the worlds that were waiting to be connected to the transportation network layer. At this moment, he put all his effort into transforming the world view of laws into the improvement of his cultivation. At this moment, this had already consumed all of his energy. Apart from that, everything else was secondary to him. Even the benefits brought to him by connecting to the transportation network layer were negligible at this moment. Transforming the world view of laws into the improvement of his cultivation was not a simple matter, nor was it a task that could be completed with a pat on the head. At this moment, he integrated his body and mind into his world view of laws and the world of laws at the same time. He carefully experienced the difference between the two and the way they interacted with each other during this process. The entire world of laws underwent all kinds of indescribable changes at the same time. Wind and clouds surged, lightning flashed, and thunder rumbled. These were just the most ordinary and basic changes. On a deeper level, laws were twisted and converted, time and space were split and deformed, and so on. These were just intermediate changes. More importantly, the reversal of fate and cause and effect were the truly huge changes. Amidst these changes, all kinds of indescribable mysteries constantly surged out from the depths of the world of laws and gradually appeared in the world. They were seen by all living beings in the world, and they were also sensed by the will of the world's founders, who had already integrated into the many parallel worlds. Sensing this, the wills fell into an indescribable silence. It wasn't that they had nothing to say, but that they didn't have the mood to talk anymore. Because the principles and profundities revealed by these various changes had completely drawn their attention, and it caused them to be utterly unable to divert their attention to think about anything else, as they were deeply afraid of missing the numerous profundities revealed before them. Under such circumstances, the law of heaven and earth seemed even calmer at this level. It was as if the whole world had become incomparably harmonious. Time slowly passed in this extremely harmonious atmosphere. Whether it was the flow of time in the world of laws or the flow of time in the transportation network layer, it was the same. Unknowingly, more than 100,000 years had passed. Moreover, this was only the flow of time in the transportation network layer. In the world of laws, the flow of time was more than 100 times longer. In other words, tens of millions of years during this period of time, whether it was the law realm or the transportation network layer, the changes were almost earth-shattering. Needless to say, this period of time in the world of laws was a rare opportunity for development after the world of laws had completely survived the third great tribulation of the world. Such an opportunity for development was so rare that over tens of millions of years, it was enough to cause earth-shattering changes in many parallel worlds and the main body of the world. Whether it was the level of the cultivation world or other aspects, it was already worlds apart from tens of millions of years ago. The existence of many parallel worlds had already unknowingly become common knowledge, and countless methods and techniques had been developed specifically to deal with the existence of many parallel worlds. The most exaggerated thing was that the occupations of the parallel worlds had begun to appear in the world of laws. Any one of these changes was enough to overturn the worldview of other world founders, making them suspect that it wasn't tens of millions of years that had passed, but trillions of years instead. In contrast, the changes in the transportation network layer were much smaller than the changes in the world of laws, but it was still extremely shocking. At the very least, more than 100,000 years ago in the transportation network layer, all the world founders had never thought that the transportation network layer would develop to such a level. At this time, almost every world had fallen into a tribulation. Over the past hundreds of thousands of years, every world connected to the transportation network layer had been noticed by the tribulation layer. Every world had been drowned by the power of the tribulation, completely immersed in the tribulation and suffering the increasingly powerful and terrifying Great Tribulation of the world. Among them, some of the Great Tribulations were the first Great Tribulation of the world, while some had already begun the Second Great Tribulation. Among these many worlds, There were even some that could no longer withstand the impact of the great tribulation of the world. Now they had either lost their own world or perished along with their own world. Of course, these worlds were generally the kind that hadn't communicated with the heavenly Tao incarnation of Luo Fan's world of laws in time, or rather, had made a deal with it. If there was a world that could react in time, communicate with the world of laws in time, and invite the heavenly Tao incarnation of the world of laws in time, no matter how bad the outcome was, it could still maintain itself in the tribulation. Although it wouldn't directly overcome the great tribulation of the world, it wouldn't be completely destroyed in the great tribulation either. Such worlds were generally those that had already distanced themselves from the world of laws, or those that had sensed that the world of laws had some means against them. Some of these worlds would rather die than have anything to do with the world of laws, while some had regretted it in the end. This situation made many of the founders start to feel suspicious. The world founders couldn't tell what was going on with the worlds that had distanced themselves from the world of laws. They didn't know what they were worried about. All they saw was that the degree of danger they faced when they distanced themselves from the world of laws and faced the great tribulation of the world. Under such circumstances, those worlds began to take the initiative to get closer to the world of laws. This kind of closeness created all kinds of conflicts between them. This kind of conflict was extremely subtle, and it was a conflict of status in the transportation network layer. Due to this conflict, although the distance between the many worlds was extremely far, to the point that it couldn't even be measured by real distance, their positions in the transportation network layer would still clash. However, their positions in the transportation network layer would still conflict, and they could not coexist. As a result, it triggered some kind of war for position. The scale of this war was sporadic at the beginning, but it eventually became very noisy and almost became the mainstream of the transportation network layer. Most of these worlds were actually caused by the tribulations. Even if they acted as if there were no tribulations, that was only because the heavenly Tao incarnation of the world of laws was helping them suppress the tribulations in their worlds. Under such circumstances, the impact of the war became greater and greater. Under this influence, the tribulations between the many worlds actually began to fuse, interfere with each other, and influence each other. Under this interference and influence, the heavenly Tao incarnation began to find it more and more difficult to deal with. At first, it was still able to completely suppress the tribulations, preventing the worlds from showing any signs of the tribulations. But as time passed, as the war between the worlds became more and more intense, the signs gradually began to appear. And the appearance of these signs increased the danger of the worlds, causing the blows the worlds suffered in the war to become greater and greater. This, in turn, began to push the war to continue to intensify, making the war more and more terrifying. If time continued like this, the war would continue to intensify, and in the end, the entire transportation network layer would be completely involved in it. It might even completely include Luo Fan's world of laws, causing an impact that was many times more severe than it was now. However, this transportation network layer was obviously Luo Fan's transportation network layer. Everything here was built by him, and everything here was also under his control. One day, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable danger surging in his heart. He couldn't help but return to his senses from the state of trying to transform his cultivation realm, and shifted his attention to the entire transportation network layer outside. The moment he saw the changes in the transportation network layer, he couldn't help but feel a little lost. What's going on? What benefits are there for them to fight over? Why are they starting such a tragic war? Looking at the war, he couldn't understand what the many world founders were fighting over at all. There was definitely a struggle for benefits in a war. Even if it was a war caused by hatred, there would still be the pleasure of revenge. But now, Luo Fan didn't know what benefits there were in the transportation network layer for the world's founders to compete with each other. It could make those founders of heaven and earth carry out this kind of war without regard for anything else. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. He only needed to observe the form of the war to completely guess what they were fighting over. They're actually fighting for a position in the transportation network layer. How did they come up with such a misunderstanding? After discovering this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel between laughter and tears. At this time, he felt sorry for the world founders who had lost everything in the war. This war is completely meaningless, he sighed and said. This sentence instantly spread out of the world of laws, and in the blink of an eye, it flowed along the many paths in the transportation network layer, directly passing through all the worlds that were connected to the transportation network layer, and entered the ears of the world founders. The moment they heard this sentence, the world founders couldn't help but be stunned. They obviously didn't expect Luo Fan to actually make such a judgment on their war at this time. This was actually very easy to understand. It was obviously impossible for the beginning of the war to enter such a fierce level all of a sudden. The beginning of the war would definitely start from probing each other. And from the beginning of the probing, Luo Fan actually already had the opportunity to discover the signs of their war and had the opportunity to stop it. However, it had been tens of thousands of years since the beginning of the war, but Luo Fan didn't care about their war at all, nor did he interfere with their fight at all. Under such circumstances, no matter how they thought about it, they would feel that Luo Fan didn't care about this war at all, and might even want to see this war. This mentality had almost been deeply engraved in the hearts of all the world founders. It was precisely because of this that they completely ignored the possible reactions that Luo Fan might have made over the years, and instead just fought each other for a position in the transportation network layer. However, they didn't expect that at this time, when they had almost regarded the understanding that Luo Fan wouldn't care about their war as common sense, Luo Fan actually spoke. He actually directly declared that their war was completely meaningless. How could these pioneers of heaven and earth accept such a thing? Sir, what do you mean? Why is our war meaningless? One of the heaven and earth creator asked carefully. This world founder was the world founder of the world closest to Luo Fan's world of laws. According to the goal of the war, it was obvious that this world had already walked to the forefront of the war and obtained the most victories among the many worlds. Hearing this, Luo Fan just sighed and said, "Whether you're close or far from me doesn't have any effect on whether you've passed the Great Tribulation or not. No matter how close or far away you are from me, it won't change. Unless you let me directly help you with the incarnation of the heavenly law." Many world founders were stunned at this moment. Chapter 2768. At that moment, the many founders in the transportation network suddenly understood how the living beings in the worlds they created felt towards them. That feeling was probably the same as what they were feeling right now. It was the feeling that they had turned into ants, that everything was under the control of other existences, and that their own power could not shake that fact at all. Although Luo Fan had only said such a sentence, they could not doubt him at all. Those words were like the truth, like the great Tao, directly engraved in the depths of their hearts, making them instinctively revere and not dare to have any thoughts of resisting. It was precisely because of the powerful ability of his voice that the entire transportation network layer fell into a complete silence because of his words. Luo Fan looked at the many worlds that had fallen into silence. He did not show anything on his face and only felt that everything was as it should be. How could this be? That was the only thought in the minds of the founders at that moment. They naturally did not doubt what Luo Fan said at that moment. Although they were unwilling, their instincts and even their rationality told them that those words were true. There was no need to say much about their instincts. Those words directly penetrated their instincts and their hearts, eliminating their instinctive rejection and vigilance. That naturally made them believe those words instinctively. As for their rationality, there was no need to say much. Everything was clearly in the hands of Luo Fan, and there was no need for Luo Fan to lie to them. Their deaths were really not worth it. Some of the founders smiled bitterly. Why did they suddenly become so fanatical? Some of the founders began to think about the various abnormalities from before. No matter how one looked at it, the outbreak of this war was too sudden. According to their temperaments, they should not have so easily broken out into conflicts with other worlds. Even if a conflict broke out, they should not have fallen into the quagmire of war. However, it was as if their rationality had been obscured by something before. They actually became impulsive and irritable, like firecrackers that would explode at the slightest touch. In the end, the war broke out and developed to an almost unmanageable state. They did not feel that at that time, but now that they had woken up, they felt that there were flaws everywhere. Could it be that he is scheming against us? Suddenly, the hearts of some pioneers shook slightly, and they turned their gazes towards the world that was still changing incessantly at the center. In the transportation network layer, the only one who had the ability to cover their rationality and make them irritable and agitated seemed to be the master of the core world, Luo Fan. If it was him, why would he stop us from continuing to fight? Could it be that he has already achieved his goal? The Heaven and Earth founder continued to ponder, and his hair stood on end. If he continued to think in this direction, then all the previous situations seemed to have an explanation. Moreover, even if Luo Fan had stopped them from continuing to fight, there seemed to be some explanations from the details. This kind of situation was like associating. If two completely unrelated things were innately connected, then the more one looked at it, the more likely it was that there was a connection. At this time, this was the case for the creator of this world. Luo Fan actually had no direct connection with the war itself. However, the more he thought about it, the more he started to find all sorts of specious reasons. Or rather, he started to create them. The benefits that Luo Fan might obtain were also constantly being produced in this process. This kind of thinking was not the mainstream. But obviously, it was not just one world founder who thought this way. At this time, more and more world founders began to look at Luo Fan's world and the center of the transportation network layer with an inexplicable glint in their eyes. Luo Fan was naturally unaware of all this. After all, it was impossible for him to grasp the thoughts of those world founders. For him, he, who had not participated in this war at all, had a clear conscience. As someone who had a clear conscience, how could he have guessed that the other world founders would think that he was the mastermind? If he did not think in this direction, it was naturally impossible for him to discover that the other world founders had pinned all of this on him. At this time, he only continued to transform the improvement of his worldview into the improvement of his cultivation realm. After tens of millions of years of accumulation, he was actually nearing the end of this process. In other words, it was coming to an end. At this moment, compared to before, his cultivation had actually increased by quite a bit. At this moment, if his cultivation realm was measured according to the number of tribulations, it was equivalent to reaching the peak of the seventh tribulation. Currently, he was undergoing his seventh tribulation, and he still could not see the direction of this tribulation. However, his cultivation realm had unknowingly risen to the peak of the seventh tribulation. This strength and speed of improvement was enough to shock anyone. Even he felt inexplicably excited at this moment, and his heart was filled with boundless confidence. To face the seventh tribulation with the strength of the peak of the seventh tribulation, no matter what was special about this seventh tribulation, he had absolute confidence that he could easily overcome it. Not to mention that his cultivation realm had yet to reach the limit. Perhaps when he completely transformed the growth of his worldview into the improvement of his cultivation realm could undergo a qualitative change, and he could finally break through the limit and step into the eighth tribulation. Although this hope was very small, it was not zero, and it was worth looking forward to. It was because of this good mood that he did not pay much attention to the thoughts of the many world founders in the transportation network layer, nor did he pay attention to their doubts about him. Time continued to pass. In the blink of an eye, another few thousand years passed. In the transportation network layer, many heavens and earths had completely recovered from the absurd war that had just occurred. At the very least, on the surface, they had recovered from the war. Apart from the world founders who had completely perished in the war, even the world founders who had lost their own worlds in the war had used methods to re-establish their own worlds in the past few thousand years. Although the newly established worlds were much weaker than the original worlds, and they still needed to grow a few times before they could catch up to the original world. However, with these newly established worlds, the world founders were no longer as unconcealed as before, and they could communicate with other world founders on equal footing. Of course, the overall situation seemed to have recovered, but the hatred created by the war couldn't possibly disappear just like that. Their own worlds were destroyed, and the fruits of their hard work over billions of years were wiped out. How could this be a simple hatred? The fact that they didn't fight to the death with the other party was already a sign that they were rational and strong enough. How could they still have no grudges like in the beginning? With the passage of time, the opinion that Luo Fan was the mastermind behind the scenes began to spread and was gradually known by more and more creators of the world. Most world founders didn't believe this, but there were also a small number of world founders who believed it to be the truth when they heard this possibility. Along with this change, the positions of the many worlds in the transportation network layer started to shift. More and more world founders started to move towards the edge of the transportation network layer, causing the area closest to the world they were fighting for to gradually become empty. After thousands of years, the appearance of the entire transportation network has become like a donut. If Luo Fan was paying attention to the situation in the transportation network layer, he would have been able to tell from the changes that the creators of the world were already at odds with him. But it was a pity that Luo Fan wasn't in the mood to pay attention to this at this moment. The mentality of many world founders was reflected in the position of the world, and as the position of the world shifted, it gradually affected the mentality of more and more world founders. Even the world creators who regarded that suspicion as nonsense had their own firm confidence gradually wavered as more and more world creators became disloyal to Luo Fan and began to shift their own worlds backward. After all, they instinctively denied the possibility that Luo Fan was the mastermind behind the scenes, and that was only based on their understanding of Luo Fan. There wasn't any strong evidence to prove that this was nonsense at all. Clearly, an understanding of living beings was the most unreliable guarantee. No one dared to say that they had a complete understanding of another person. No one dared to say that the other person they knew was the real person. It was the same for world founders like them. Moreover, Luo Fan had always been unfathomable and mysterious in their eyes. Under such circumstances, how could these world founders dare to say that their understanding of Luo Fan's method was everything about Luo Fan? How could they dare to say that the judgment they made based on their understanding of Luo Fan was really the truth? Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't persist in this argument forever, and they would naturally be gradually affected by the attitudes of other world founders. As more and more world founders began to doubt Luo Fan, they would also unknowingly follow suit. Unknowingly, they would allow their own world to follow the flow of the general flow and begin to drift away from the direction of the world of laws. In this way, the empty area near Luo Fan's world of laws became larger and larger. In the end, after thousands of years, Luo Fan's world of laws, which should have been the core area of the entire transportation network layer, became like a rural area and became lonely. There was no world at all in the vast area, and only some roads connected many worlds to the world of laws. On this day, the world of laws trembled slightly, and some kind of indescribable fluctuation erupted from the world of laws. It swept through the entire transportation network layer in the blink of an eye. These fluctuations were so wonderful and incredible. In the process of being released, they directly penetrated the interior of many worlds, penetrated all the defenses of many worlds, and even penetrated the many world founders, making them feel as if all their secrets had been snatched away by these fluctuations. What's going on? All the world founders were shocked at this moment. They could understand why these fluctuations were so powerful. After all, they came from Luo Fan, the unfathomable and powerful existence that they didn't know what he had been doing all this time. Although it was somewhat unexpected for him to have such an ability, they could actually understand it. After all, this was still within the scope that they could accept. However, at this time, Luo Fan released these fluctuations and faced them with such an attitude, which made them feel a little puzzled. This wasn't a special time. In the transportation network layer, there wasn't a trace of abnormality between the many worlds. All the world founders, all the worlds, and everything was operating according to the original rules. At such a very ordinary time, why would Luo Fan need to use such fluctuations to clean up the entire transportation network layer? However, many world founders soon understood that Luo Fan wasn't targeting them. At this time, this kind of cleaning wasn't Luo Fan's real intention or purpose. The fluctuations at this time were actually just the aftermath of the changes in Luo Fan's world of laws. Or rather, it was just the aftermath of the changes in Luo Fan's body. At this moment, they could already see that the world of laws seemed to have turned into a huge living being that began to stretch and shrink like a heartbeat. It was as if some unimaginable power had instantly activated the world of laws. At the same time, Luo Fan's projection appeared above the world, as if he had suddenly turned into a giant and sat cross-legged where the world was. In that instant, many of the founders of the world felt that it wasn't the world of laws there, but Luo Fan. Chapter 2770. All sorts of distortions continued to spread in all directions. It was naturally impossible for the surrounding heavens and earths to be so coincidental that they would be affected. During this process, there were still some worlds that were within the range of the fluctuations. Under the influence of the fluctuations, they began to distort and collapse. Instead of being destroyed by the great calamity, they were going to be destroyed by the subtle changes of Luo Fan's world of laws. Fortunately, the worlds closest to Luo Fan's world of laws had already made deals with Luo Fan. In other words, they were worlds that already possessed the embodiment of the heavenly Tao of the world of laws. At this moment, the incarnation of the heavenly Tao that belonged to the world began to take action. It manipulated the power of the world, and began to display various changes. It used all kinds of subtle means and indescribable power to make the world obey the terrifying fluctuations. It managed to protect the world under the influence of the fluctuations with great difficulty. At the very least, it prevented those worlds from collapsing completely. As for the losses, it was inevitable. This influence even shook the foundation of the entire transportation network layer, causing the entire transportation network layer to tremble slightly. The connections between many worlds and the roads between them seemed to be shrouded in some sort of strange mist. This situation made the hearts of many world founders shrouded in a strong sense of unease. The existence of the transportation network layer was both a restraint and a form of support for the many founders of the world. The restraint was because of the existence of the transportation network layer and the world of laws. At this moment, they already had a lot of doubts about the world of laws and Luo Fan, and they no longer dared to trust Luo Fan. It was because of the existence of the transportation network that they were not lonely. It allowed them to communicate with the other founders of the world, and it allowed them to find their own kind in the simulated state of chaos. If there was no transportation network, then they might not be able to escape the influence of Luo Fan's world of laws. However, they would definitely lose their other companions. They would lose the many founders of the world that had gradually become their daily routine and had become a matter of course for them. Realizing this situation, how could the world founders not feel a strong sense of unease? Under this strong sense of unease, some of the world founders began to contact each other. They began to discuss how to contact each other after the collapse of the transportation network layer, and how to re-establish a similar chaotic simulation layer. Of course, these were only a minority of the world's founders. More pioneers of heaven and earth clearly understood how difficult it was to connect, and even more clearly understood how dangerous it was to connect. Therefore, at this time, they were only watching cautiously and did not really take any action. As for the various situations in the traffic network layer, Luo Fan was just like before, completely ignoring them. At this time, he was just trying his best to restrain himself and separate himself from the world of laws. Along with this change, the world of laws, which looked like it had transformed into Luo Fan's body, had returned to its original appearance. It was as if it had turned into a group of worlds that was constantly growing and expanding. At the same time, the connection between the many parallel locations, which had been opened up to allow ordinary beings to pass through, had already shrunk. Although it wasn't as if it had completely disappeared, as if it didn't exist anymore, it was no longer possible for ordinary living beings to pass through. Under this change, the great changes in the entire world of laws began to gradually slow down. Although the influence of living beings from different parallel universes entering other parallel universes would be endless, under the influence of the parallel universes themselves, the influence would only diminish with the passage of time. Because of the existence of the connections between many parallel locations, this influence could not completely disappear in the end, but it would no longer cause as much danger as before. After fully recovering, Luo Fan let out a long breath. I almost suffered a backlash. At this moment, he truly felt that the most important thing he needed to do was to reorganize his worldview and his cultivation realm. He used temporary ideas to make up for his worldview. Although it brought him endless benefits for a while, it also planted hidden dangers. If he didn't pay attention to it, the change just now would be the most likely outcome. If he wasn't vigilant enough, he might be completely changed by those worldviews and become no longer himself. In a way, his previous behavior could be said to be not worth it. However, it was obvious that this method was unavoidable. At least, based on his current understanding, the cultivation method just now that obviously had many hidden dangers was unavoidable. There was no other reason than because he needed a foundation and a framework. Even though there were too many problems with this foundation and this framework, it was still indispensable. It was like building a building that was dozens of floors tall. Could the initial design be completed in one go? Could it be that he could immediately complete the final design just by starting to draw? A real design would always need to be designed, modified, and perfected over and over again before it could be formed. For Luo Fan, his worldview was the initial design, the most basic structure. If he didn't have the initial design, what foundation would he use to modify these designs? What foundation would he use to perfect these ideas? Therefore, even if these ideas had many hidden dangers and might eventually change his own thinking and will, these were unavoidable. Even if there was such a danger, he had to do it. Fortunately, he could clearly recognize this, unlike other cultivators who didn't feel any abnormalities at all. As long as he could clearly recognize this, it was equivalent to clearly knowing the imperfections in a certain design and clearly understanding the parts that should be modified. This was equivalent to completely marking out the possible hidden dangers. In this way, the possibility of being affected was much smaller than usual. At least, as long as Luo Fan wasn't too careless, he wouldn't really be affected and really end up in an irreversible situation. After sorting out the many ideas and carefully experiencing the various situations of the ideas, Luo Fan finally relaxed. At least for now, it hadn't really affected him. After relaxing, he just noticed the situation in the transportation network layer at this moment. Luo Fan was the core, the ruler, and even the creator of the entire transportation network layer. How could any changes in the transportation network layer escape his detection? With his ability, in an instant, he completely understood the changes in the transportation network layer over the past few days, and he understood the concerns of the many world founders. At this moment, his expression changed slightly. It's developing too quickly. Normally, it wouldn't be like this without tens of millions of years. At this moment, he didn't directly blame the other world founders, but he immediately felt that something was wrong. It was very normal for the many world founders in the transportation network layer to discover the abnormality, be wary of him, and even start to reject him. After all, the nature of the transportation network layer was right there. In the transportation network layer, the situation where Luo Fan's world of laws was superior to many worlds was not concealed at all. Under such circumstances, the world founders would be able to sense the abnormality after a long time. As a result, they would become dissatisfied with Luo Fan and reject the world of laws. This was not surprising at all. However, according to his calculations, it would still take at least tens of millions of years for these thoughts to completely erupt. But at this time, how long had it been in the transportation network layer? It had only been a short few 100,000 years. In just a few 100,000 years, they had actually completed the change in thinking that would have taken tens of millions of years before. This situation didn't seem right no matter how he looked at it. Is it some kind of shackle or something else? Luo Fan thought to himself as he sensed the transportation network layer very carefully, feeling the slightest change in it. Everything in the transportation network layer was within his senses. At this moment, under his will, all the hidden secrets were revealed without reservation. At this moment, the many world founders in the transportation network layer could clearly feel some kind of will probing all their secrets from the inside out. The strength of this probing was tens of thousands of times stronger than the fluctuations they had sensed before. At this moment, they could clearly feel that everything about them was no longer hidden in the other party's eyes. What is this? You're no longer trying to hide it? At this moment, the founders of the universe were filled with intense anger. It was a kind of anger directed at Luo Fan, a kind of anger directed at their own fate. One had to know that the pioneers of the world actually thought highly of themselves. As the world founders and the creators of countless living beings, they definitely did not think that they were inferior to other living beings. Even if it was Luo Fan, they only thought that they were temporarily inferior to him in terms of strength. In essence, they did not think that Luo Fan could really surpass them. However, at this moment they were humiliated once again. In their opinion, Luo Fan's probing of them was a direct insult to them. Waves of anger surged from the bottom of their hearts and gradually surged towards their worlds. The anger of some world founders even rushed out of their own worlds and surged into the transportation network layer. Gradually, it affected a larger and larger area of the transportation network layer, causing more and more areas of the transportation network layer to be infected. Gradually, a change that many world founders could not have anticipated occurred. An existence similar to the power of a tribulation was born from the anger. At this moment, Luo Fan instantly grasped the anger. He slightly furrowed his brows, and a faint cold glint appeared in his eyes. Tribulation level. At this moment, he had already grasped the root of everything. He had grasped the root of the rejection and hostility of many world founders in the transportation network layer. The root of everything was the tribulation level. Or rather, it was the power of the tribulation. At this moment, he suddenly felt that the tribulation power contained in many worlds was already faintly resonating with him. The resonance wasn't obvious, and it could even be said to be faintly discernible. If it wasn't for the various powers brought about by the fury of the founders of the world, he might not even be able to sense the existence of the resonance. The effect of this resonance was none other than treating the various worlds as unit. The power of the tribulations in the various worlds was the most basic detail, and they were connected together. As the silver-gray resonance resonated, the power of the tribulations in the various worlds became a small part of a huge whole. The effect of this huge whole was none other than to impose a tribulation on the transportation network layer. It was to make the transportation network layer undergo a test. Even the simulated chaos layer is going to encounter a tribulation? At this moment, Luo Fan had already found a deeper root. The tribulation level clearly could not have the will of a living being. At least for now, Luo Fan had not found any signs of the will of a living being. Since that was the case, the tribulation level could be regarded as some kind of rule without the will of a living being. Under such circumstances, any changes in the tribulation level would obviously follow the rule. The tribulation level began to exert changes on the transportation network layer, and began to pour its power into the transportation network layer. This clearly showed that according to the fundamental rule of the tribulation level, the transportation network layer itself needed to be attacked by the tribulation power and be tested by the tribulation power. The effect of this attack and this test was rather mysterious and obscure. It was something that ordinary world founders could not understand. However, a test was a test, and an attack was an attack. Its existence would inevitably gradually change the transportation network layer, gradually changing the many worlds in the transportation network layer, and even the world founders. Chapter 2771. The various anomalies in the transportation network layer were the result of the tribulation layer's effect on the tribulation power that simulated the chaos layer's tribulation power. This kind of power was mysterious and subtle. It scattered and fused with the many worlds in the simulated chaotic layer. It appeared in the form of the Great Tribulation of the world, and even disappeared in the form of the Great Tribulation of the world. But in essence, they were the tribulation of the simulated chaos layer. This was a kind of tribulation that Luo Fan had never seen before, and he didn't even know that it existed. Does this exist in the true state of chaos, or is it just a tribulation that exists in this simulated state of chaos? At this time, such doubts emerged in Luo Fan's mind. Almost everything in the simulated chaos layer was constructed according to the real chaos layer. This included the endless worlds, the great tribulation of the world, and the experiences of the creators of the world when they entered the simulated chaos layer. Everything was constructed according to the real chaos layer. Everything that existed here, in the real chaos layer, had a great possibility of having a corresponding reality. Perhaps there would be a difference in the performance, and it might even be as different as the sky and the earth, but the similarity of the root could definitely be found. Since everything else was constructed according to the real chaos layer, then was this tribulation that targeted the transportation network layer, or rather, the tribulation that targeted the simulated chaos layer, also existing in the real chaos layer? Could it be that the true chaos layer would also need to suffer such a tribulation and endure such a tribulation? There was almost no doubt about the answer to this question. At this moment, Luo Fan had already given an affirmative answer in the first place. Everything else was real, and everything else had a corresponding reality. Why couldn't the tribulation of the simulated chaos layer have a corresponding reality in the real chaos layer? Was it because this reality was something that Luo Fan had never heard of or even thought of before? How was this possible? Since he admitted that everything else had a corresponding reality, then obviously, he could only admit that this tribulation also had a corresponding reality. The chaotic layer also has such a tribulation? Then, doesn't that mean that even the great heaven and earth might not be truly without tribulations and immeasurable? As this thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind, his expression became inexplicably complicated. A perfect heaven and earth could transform into a great heaven and earth after going through 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth. In the end, it would be like a living being becoming a true sage, with no tribulations and immeasurable, eternal and indestructible. This was a concept that had been established ever since he learned about the nature of the Great Tribulation. Apart from perfecting his worldview, Luo Fan's greatest dream had always been to help the primordial world survive the 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth and the world of laws that he had created. But now, he realized that going through the 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth and transforming heaven and earth into the grand heaven and earth might not be the end. That, perhaps, was only the beginning. Tribulations would still follow him like a shadow, and they could still affect the world. Although it wasn't enough to overturn his view of the world, it still made him feel complicated and indescribable, and he couldn't sort out his thoughts for a while. However, the harvest of this tribulation transcendence is beyond my imagination. Then, he suddenly smiled, and there was an inexplicable excitement in his eyes. Directly coming into contact with the chaotic state and experiencing it from a macroscopic perspective was obviously still extremely far away for him. After all, with his current strength, he could only use his perception to slightly break through the barrier of the world and come into contact with the chaotic state. The chaotic state that he obtained would be like an ant lying on the body of an elephant and trying to determine what the universe the elephant was like by detecting the situation around the elephant. Perhaps, at some point, this ant's intelligence would explode and it would be able to see through the various subtle phenomena and figure out the past, present, and future of the entire universe through various subtle signs, just like how a physicist could figure out what the universe the elephant was like. However, it was obvious that the probability of that happening was extremely small. Luo Fan's current size was equivalent to that of an ant. The world he was attached to, no matter which world it was equivalent to that elephant. The chaotic state that he wanted to understand was equivalent to the universe that the elephant was in. Under such circumstances, if he were to directly face the chaotic state, one could imagine how difficult it would be for him to truly establish an overall model of the chaotic state and correctly understand the entire chaotic state given his strength and level. It could be said that under normal circumstances, unless he became a true sage, he would not even think of such a possibility. However, in this great calamity, the simulated chaotic state had given him a great opportunity. Compared to the real chaotic state, the simulated chaotic state was like a model of the real chaotic state. Be it in terms of size or level, this model was far inferior to the real chaotic state. Therefore, Luo Fan, who was the same size as the ant, already had the opportunity to figure out the true appearance of the entire model and the appearance of the real chaotic state that the model referred to. For example, it was almost impossible for the ant to figure out the entire universe outside the body of the elephant. However, although it was not easy to figure out the appearance of the elephant and understand its many characteristics, it had become possible from the original almost impossible. To Luo Fan, the simulated chaotic state was obviously like an ant to an elephant. This time, Luo Fan was almost reluctant to get through the 7th tribulation so quickly. At this moment, he felt even more clearly that the great tribulations that he had encountered were actually opportunities given to him by the chaotic state. In other words, the chaotic state was an opportunity for the cultivators who walked the path of the opposite direction. The disciples of the true sages had always felt that walking the path of the opposite direction was against the path of cultivation and the rules of the chaotic state. The tribulations that they encountered were signs that the chaotic state was dissatisfied. However, at this moment, he felt that perhaps the cultivators who walked the path of the opposite direction were what the chaotic state wanted to see. These tribulations might not be the punishment of the chaotic state, but the benefits that the chaotic state gave them. It was the chaotic state that nurtured them. Of course, one naturally could not expect the chaotic state to take care of one in every possible way like a parent. The opportunity and benefits were given to one, but one did not grasp them. If one could not even withstand the test of the benefits, then one could only blame oneself for being useless. The chaotic state could not be blamed at all. All these thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression gradually calmed down. Let me see what kind of tribulations this is. Luo Fan's eyes flickered, and the transportation network layer in his eyes began to undergo subtle changes. The originally empty transportation network layer was instantly shrouded in an indescribable layer of fog. This fog was faintly discernible, and seemed to exist at the same time. However, it was constantly seeping into all the roads in the transportation network layer, including the heaven and earth. At this moment, even the heaven and earth were enduring the infiltration of this fog. This fog clearly possessed the characteristics of a tribulation layer. In other words, it was a type of tribulation power. It constantly remained in the tribulation layer, pouring into the transportation network layer, passing through many heaven and earth, and finally fusing into the depths of the transportation network layer. It was starting to brew something within. What a wonderful tribulation! I wonder what kind of tribulation the universe would encounter in the true chaotic state layer. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The universe itself had already gone through 9 great tribulations of the universe. In essence, such a universe was already without tribulations and immeasurable. However, he now realized that the universe might still encounter tribulations, and perhaps it would still be targeted by tribulations. After all, it was impossible for the universe to exist outside of the chaotic state layer. The chaotic state layer itself was just an abstraction of the universe's influence on the chaotic state. In this way, as long as the universe was in a chaotic state, it would naturally establish a chaotic state layer, or rather, a chaotic layer. This nature wouldn't be different depending on whether the universe was a perfect universe or a universe. Since that was the case, as long as the universe didn't break free from the chaotic state, it would definitely attach itself to a chaotic layer. Perhaps it was built by itself, or perhaps it was built by another universe, and obviously, if Luo Fan's conjecture was the truth, in other words, any chaos stratum would definitely encounter a tribulation. Then, didn't it mean that the chaos stratum where the great heaven and earth were would also encounter a tribulation? And the chaotic layer and the universe obviously wouldn't encounter tribulations at the same time. Moreover, it was impossible for all the universes in a chaotic layer to be the universe. In this case, it was impossible for the universe to not encounter tribulations in the chaotic layer. If that was the case, what would happen to the universe during the tribulations? If the universe was also attacked by tribulations, it would also collapse and perish in the tribulations. Wouldn't that contradict the fact that the universe itself was without tribulations and immeasurable? However, if the tribulations couldn't affect the universe, then what was the point of the tribulations in the chaotic layer's existence? Therefore, there must be some mechanism in the universe that Luo Fan couldn't understand to resolve this contradiction, so that the paradox between the universe and the chaotic layer, which couldn't coexist, could be alleviated. As he pondered, Luo Fan turned his gaze to the vast tribulation layer that shrouded the transportation network layer. At this moment, countless passageways extended from the tribulation layer, connecting the various universes in the transportation network layer. In the past, Luo Fan didn't think that there was anything special about these passageways. At most, he felt that they were more densely packed. But now, after his understanding had changed, he understood that the many passageways were actually many things that were one. Behind these passageways, there was an even larger passageway. These passageways were actually scattered from that huge passageway. As his understanding changed, he looked again and found that the countless passageways were like rays of the sun, radiating in all directions from a single point. It felt like a huge umbrella. The top of the umbrella was where the tribulation layer touched. All the tribulation passageways originated from this point, from the vast tribulation world behind this point. That's right. At this moment, Luo Fan could clearly see that the countless tribulations in the transportation network layer came from an extremely complete and extremely strange tribulation world. That world was hidden in the tribulation layer and was vague. Even with Luo Fan's perception, he could only vaguely grasp that world. As for the specific appearance of that world, he couldn't see it clearly. While Luo Fan was observing the situation in the transportation network layer and the tribulation layer, the many heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer had already made further move. Those heaven and earth founders couldn't directly grasp the root of the changes in the transportation network layer like Luo Fan could. To them, all their changes were because they had seen the truth and recognized the conspiracy of Luo Fan in the center of the transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, they naturally wouldn't think too much about other things. At this time, they were just looking for a chance to break free from the restrictions and misfortune they encountered. The actions of these heaven and earth founders at this time were not to directly attack the laws of the world, but to attack the paths that were connected to them. They began to use all means and methods to completely cut off these paths. Although these heaven and earth founders were much weaker than Luo Fan, they were still heaven and earth founders after all. They were existences that could create heaven and earth in this simulated state of chaos. How could they not understand the transportation network layer after being in the transportation network layer for such a long time? How could they not have studied the roads in the transportation network layer at all? Chapter 2772. The entire transportation network layer fell into endless chaos in the blink of an eye. Many of the world founders had their own thoughts and ways to deal with it. If it was before, they might have discussed things rationally and cautiously so that they could interfere with each other as little as possible so that they would not drag each other down. However, this was clearly something that would only happen under normal circumstances. What was happening in the transportation network layer was clearly not normal. Here, it was a tribulation that targeted the transportation network layer. In such a tribulation, things that were clearly beneficial to the world founders might not necessarily satisfy the requirements of the tribulation. Therefore, under the indescribable manipulation of the tribulation, the world founders' actions became like this. Their methods influenced and interfered with each other, and in the end, they could not achieve their goals. In the end, none of them could truly sever those paths and achieve their goals. On the contrary, the damage to the transportation network layer was getting bigger and bigger as time passed, becoming more and more shocking. At this moment, Luo Fan was paying close attention to all of this, and his expression became solemn. Above the tribulation layer was a world that released endless tribulations. Although it looked rather small from here, in reality, it contained extremely many things, and its structure was indescribably complex. Just by sensing it from afar, Luo Fan could already sense an extremely vast and powerful aura from it. Under this aura, the power of the countless tribulations released from the world seemed to be moving in a seemingly random manner, but it was actually following some indescribable law. These various movements caused the tribulations in the world to change, and the minds of the world founders were also vaguely affected. Suddenly, at a certain moment, under all sorts of seemingly coincidental changes that were actually inevitable, the power released by the many founders of the world interweaved with each other and gave birth to boundless vitality. They formed countless living beings that appeared on the roads of the transportation network layer. As soon as these living beings appeared, they began to increase and sublimate at an unimaginable speed. In the beginning, they were extremely weak, and could only live and die as they pleased. They could not even gain a foothold in the transportation network layer. However, as time passed and the various changes triggered by the power of the world's founders, the living beings began to strengthen rapidly and gradually gained a foothold on the transportation network layer. Once they gained a foothold, these living beings began to expand outward. The transportation network layer could accommodate countless worlds. Although many of the paths did not truly follow the principles of space and time, under the senses of living beings, they were definitely larger than all the worlds combined. In such a place, one could imagine how much space there was for these creatures to expand and survive. It could be said that the number of living beings in this world could not even compare to the number of living beings in this world, let alone the fact that these living beings were still extremely rare. Even if all the living beings in the countless worlds were captured and stuffed into the many roads in the transportation network layer, the roads in the transportation network layer would never become crowded. Because they were creatures born in the transportation network layer, they were naturally very compatible with the transportation network layer. In other words, the living beings that could truly stabilize and gain a foothold in the transportation network layer were naturally very compatible with the transportation network layer. The living beings that did not fit in the transportation network layer had clearly been completely eliminated in the previous birth and death. Under such circumstances, the way these living beings expanded was very different from that of ordinary living beings in the world. They did not want to expand area by area, but they were radiating towards the entire transportation network layer. In other words, they did not start from the beginning and continuously expand in all directions, eventually radiating to the entire transportation network layer. Instead, when it began to expand, a huge number of living beings instantly flew to almost every location in the entire transportation network layer through the special characteristics of the transportation network layer. Then, they established a foothold in that location, multiplied, and finally brought that area under the control of living beings as well. It was as if countless water droplets were sprayed out from the starting point and turned into rain that covered the entire transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for everything to go smoothly. Just the mysteriousness of the transportation network layer itself was enough to pose a great threat to these living beings, causing them to encounter many unexpected environments from time to time. In the end, they would either defeat the environment or be eliminated by the environment. Not to mention, at this time, the many worlds in the transportation network layer were struggling with all their might, wanting to escape from the misfortune and trouble they now knew. In this situation where almost all the worlds were struggling, the chaos in the transportation network layer could be imagined. At this moment, almost every location was filled with incomparably chaotic power, and power was released everywhere, making it difficult to tidy up. Even if real cultivators entered such chaos, it would be difficult for them to survive, let alone these living beings who were only relying on their characteristics as natural living beings to survive in the transportation network layer. If they were really unlucky and encountered a chaotic region, it would be almost fatal for them. It was precisely because of this that the development speed of the living beings in the transportation network layer was restrained to a certain extent. Moreover, even those areas that were developing smoothly could not maintain true peace for a long time. Perhaps at this moment everything was still stable and the world was beautiful. But in the next moment the world might collapse, and everything they were familiar with would completely collapse and disappear. However, since living beings had already been born, it was naturally impossible for them to stop developing. This was especially true for these living beings that were born from the transportation network layer. The birth of these living beings was obviously not really a coincidence, but a random result. Their birth was definitely the result of this so-called layer tribulation. And this tribulation clearly did not create these living beings just to fill up the empty roads in the transportation network layer, although Luo Fan could not truly understand the meaning of the birth of these living beings. He understood that they must have their own goals, and it could even be said that they had their own conspiracies. If he did not pay attention to them, these living beings would definitely bring great damage to the transportation network layer one day. What a wonderful tribulation! After looking at the situation in the transportation network layer for a while, Luo Fan shifted his attention to his body and mind. Don't forget, a part of that tribulation had clearly penetrated the world of laws, and even his body. If he did not pay attention to it, who knew when that part of the tribulation that had penetrated the world would erupt with some power that he did not want to see, creating an outcome that he did not want to see. With a shout in his heart, Luo Fan's world of laws began to surge, quickly cleansing his body and mind, using an incomparably meticulous method to clean up the traces that existed inside and outside of his body and mind that had been penetrated by the tribulation's power. These traces were extremely obscure, and if he did not clearly know that the power had already penetrated his body, he might not have even discovered the existence of these traces. However, compared to other incomparably stubborn influences, the influence of these powers was much smaller. When he discovered the might of the tribulation, it was actually easily stripped away by her. Bit by bit, it was expelled out of his body and mind, and even further out of his world of laws. The whole process was indescribably smooth. It felt like a drop of oil had been dripped on a piece of plastic wrap. With just a light wipe, the drop of oil was completely wiped away. It seemed that the power of the tribulation couldn't truly integrate with the world of laws and him. Could it be because I've passed the third great tribulation? Feeling that the infiltration had been easily resolved, Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised. At this moment, he vaguely understood what the situation would be like when the tribulation appeared in the true state of chaos. Perhaps, at that time, the tribulation was nothing more than a performance for the world of laws. There were no tribulations in the world of laws, and the tribulation might be able to enter the world of laws because of the connection between the world of laws and the chaotic layer it was in. However, it would definitely not be able to truly shake the foundation of the world of laws, and it would definitely not be able to truly destroy the world of laws. If the ruler of the world of laws was willing to cooperate, the tribulation would naturally be able to receive some support from the world of laws, allowing the chaotic layer to be tested, tempered, and even obtain opportunities. However, if the world of laws was unwilling, then no matter how hard the tribulation tried, it would only be a problem that could be solved with a single thought. Of course, this was only his guess at this time. It was also a guess that he had made based on the situation of the world of laws at this time, as well as his own situation. It might be true, or it might be false. There might be some subtle differences, or it might be the complete opposite. As for the specifics, he could only be sure when he really reached that level in the future and encountered the real tribulation. Following this feeling, Luo Fan instantly came to a realization. He must not directly interfere with the tribulation of the transportation network layer this time. If he interfered directly, this level of tribulation would definitely seep into his world of laws and affect his body. If he did not directly interfere, then no matter how the tribulation changed, even if the entire transportation network layer was completely destroyed, it would not affect him at all. At most, he would just lose the transportation network layer. Of course, this was the case for Luo Fan because Luo Fan's world of laws had already gone through 3 great tribulations, and it had just passed the 3rd great tribulation. Because he had just passed the tribulation, the world of laws wouldn't care about him for the time being. Although it would not be as exaggerated as ignoring him, it would definitely not deliberately target him. Of course, this was only the case for Luo Fan. The situation was obviously not the same for the other worlds. For all the other worlds in the transportation network layer, the tribulation at this time was a test of life and death for them. Once they passed, then not only would they be able to integrate more closely with the transportation network layer, but they would even obtain a certain level of authority over the transportation network layer. Even their own worlds would be able to pass the great tribulation that they were currently encountering because of this. Of course, if they could not pass the tribulation, not only would they lose the connection brought by the transportation network layer, but even their own worlds might be destroyed because of this failure. The reason for this was that they were already a part of this tribulation, and it could even be said that they were the foundation of this tribulation. Once the tribulation succeeded, then their worlds would have to bear all the damage suffered by the transportation network layer at the same time. Once the tribulation failed, the tribulation that they encountered would also fail along with the tribulation. For them, the failure of the tribulation that their own worlds encountered would naturally mean that their own worlds had succeeded. Of course, for the many world founders, if they wanted to help the transportation network layer resist the tribulation, what they could do was very simple, and that was to refocus their attention on their own worlds and help them overcome the tribulation that their own worlds encountered as soon as possible. As mentioned before, the tribulation that their worlds encountered was a component of this tribulation. In this way, the tribulation of their own worlds was naturally a component that resisted the tribulation of the entire level. This kind of resistance was naturally aimed at the foundation of this level, and it went without saying that the impact would be huge and the effect would be great. Of course, if the creator of the universe was truly powerful enough to directly face the tribulation of the entire transportation network layer and set off from the many paths in the transportation network layer and the macroscopic region that simulated the entire chaos layer created by the transportation network layer to resist the tribulation, the effect would certainly not be bad. However, it was obvious that apart from Luo Fan, none of the other world founders in the transportation network layer had such an ability. However, it's not like there's no way. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly began to rejoice over the various agreements that he had made with the other world founders. Chapter 2773. Although not every world had an incarnation of the heavenly Tao of the world of laws, it could be seen from the number of world creators that had made a deal with Luo Fan and placed their incarnations into the world of laws that existed parallel to the world of laws. It could be seen how huge the number of such worlds were. It could be said that there were heavenly Tao incarnations in most of the many worlds in the transportation network layer. Before this, these heavenly Tao incarnations were only working hard to complete the deal between Luo Fan and the creators. In other words, they were working hard to help the world survive the great tribulation that the world had encountered. Such behavior could not be said to be wrong. Before this, whether it was for the transportation network layer or for the world itself, it had great benefit. For the world, the heavenly Tao incarnations helping it resist the tribulation could naturally extend the time that the world existed, allowing it to have a chance to continue living forever. The benefits were self-evident. For the transportation network layer, the stability of the component nodes was also the stability of the entire transportation network layer, which was naturally a benefit. However, that was only in the past, before the heavenly tribulation descended. As the tribulation descended, this method could no longer be as beneficial to the whole and the parts as before. At this time, the heavenly Tao incarnation's behavior of helping the world was already guided by the power of the tribulation. Although they were still helping the world survive the Great Tribulation and were still protecting the world. However, on the whole, in the eyes of the entire transportation network layer, this behavior had already become a part of the tribulation. It had become a source of power for the tribulation. If Luo Fan did not change this situation, then the final collapse of the transportation network layer would be largely due to the various means used by the heavenly Tao incarnations. Luo Fan was naturally well aware of this. There were very few existences who could boldly claim that they were stronger than him in terms of understanding the tribulation. At the very least, besides true saints, amongst all the living beings that Luo Fan had encountered up until now, there was absolutely no one that dared to say that they had a deeper understanding of tribulations than him. After learning that the transportation network layer was facing a tribulation that was completely aimed at simulating the chaos layer, although he did not immediately know the nature of the tribulation, he saw through many facts that he had previously ignored. He knew the position of his heavenly axiom incarnation in the tribulation. At this time, he knew that he couldn't directly interfere with the level tribulation, So he immediately turned his attention to the heavenly Tao incarnations that were already part of the level tribulation. As his heart trembled slightly, the heavenly Tao incarnations that were helping the heavens and earth to resist the great calamity of the world all changed their actions. These incarnations of the heavenly Tao were the bridge between Luo Fan and the creator of heaven and earth. The incarnation of the heavenly Tao would help the world resist the great calamity of the world. This was part of the agreement. However, this did not mean that the heavenly axiom incarnation's actions could only follow a fixed procedure. It could not be changed or deviated. The truth was the exact opposite, even though there was such an agreement and such a deal. However, the freedom of the heavenly axiom incarnation was unimaginably great. The reason for this seemed inconceivable, but it was actually very reasonable. This was because there were just too many ways to help the world resist the great calamity of the world, even if it did not violate the agreement between Luo Fan and the creator of heaven and earth. The heavenly axiom incarnation still had countless choices. However, it was not just doing what it had done for so many years. The reason why the heavenly axiom incarnation had chosen this method for so many years was not because this was the only method, but because this method could help the world perfectly. Now that this perfect method had been used by the level tribulation and had become part of the tribulation, Luo Fan naturally could not continue using this method. At this moment, indescribable tremors began to appear in the places where the incarnations of the heavenly Taos existed. The traces of the resistance between the world and the power of the tribulations that had originally been invisible erupted in an instant, blotting out the sky and covering the earth. For the living beings that were used to the peace of the world, this instantaneous change was like the world had turned upside down. They could not react in time at all, and they suffered huge losses in an instant. What's going on? You've violated our deal. The creator of the heaven and earth seemed to have woken up from a dream and was furious. You guys seem to be resisting, Master. This is already a violation of the premise of the deal. Among the many worlds, the creator of the heaven and earth retorted with the same plain words. Moreover, we didn't violate the deal. Aren't we helping you resist the tribulation now? There's no fundamental difference from before. Following that, the creator of the heaven and earth completely cut off the source of their condemnation. At this moment, the creator of the heaven and earth felt like a bucket of ice water had been poured over their heads. All of them instantly recovered from the indescribable anger. At this time, they really recalled what the situation was like at this time, and what they were doing at this time meant to Luo Fan. After thinking about this, the creator of the heaven and earth, who still had some moral integrity, felt a little ashamed. Soon after, they sensed slightly and understood that although the situation in the entire world seemed terrible, it was controlled within a certain range. Although it looked terrifying, it did not really affect their world that much. After understanding this, their emotions became inexplicably complicated. It was clearly a little too much to blame the incarnations of the heavenly axioms. They were already thinking of ways to cut off their connection with their master. Under such circumstances, the incarnations of the heavenly axioms were still helping their world to resist the tribulation of the world. This kind of moral integrity was enough to make any existence admire them. If they still blamed the incarnations of the heavenly axioms under such circumstances, they would not be able to live up to their moral integrity. However, it was clearly very difficult for them to feel grateful to the incarnations of the heavenly axioms. After all, they clearly could have done better, and they had done it for so many years. Yet, they changed their methods and did not continue. Instead, they allowed their world to be continuously damaged by the tribulation, causing the living beings in the world to be continuously destroyed. Under such circumstances, how could they be reasonable enough to feel grateful? Under such circumstances, how could they not feel complicated about the incarnations of the heavenly axioms? As the behavior of the incarnations of the heavenly axioms in the world changed, the living beings that were born from the tribulation on the many roads in the transportation network layer also began to experience various changes. As if they had lost some sort of guidance, they became lost and chaotic. The modification of the roads in the transportation network layer, and even the continuous expansion, had stopped. Instead, they began to fall into internal strife. This situation seemed more like those living beings had suddenly awakened their selfishness. They were no longer as selfless as before, wholeheartedly serving their own race and the living beings that were born on the roads in the transportation network layer. Instead, they began to pursue their own interests and benefit. For ordinary living beings, this would be a good thing. It meant that they had begun to move towards true completion or even true perfection. However, it was clear that this was not a good thing for the entire race. As this change occurred, the process of the living beings' proliferation was gradually curbed. And as their proliferation was curbed, the modification of the roads by those living beings also gradually appeared. The results of their modification of the roads were also gradually revealed. The roads began to have a lot of energy continuously extracted and converted into energy that could be used by those living beings. These energy were converted into resources that those living beings could use to fight for their own interests and to seek for their own advancement. It looked like ordinary living beings were constantly demanding from the world in order to grow their own race or themselves. The reason why this was only seen during the civil strife was actually very simple. It was because the efficiency of this kind of demand and conversion was really not high. In the past, when all living beings were united as one, because there were no direct conflicts or conflicts of interest between them, they would cooperate with one another and put all their efforts into the same direction. This would naturally make the entire extraction process extremely smooth. It was almost as if it had integrated into the life activities of those living beings. In this way, it was naturally difficult to discover the trend of the development of the essence of life without anyone noticing. But now, as the many living beings fell into civil strife, as they held each other back, destroyed each other's plans, and revealed each other's secrets, the various actions that were originally hidden in the spreading activities of the living beings were naturally exposed. As their civil strife developed more and more intense, the consumption and losses of the entire race became greater and greater. The living beings that were originally spread out on most of the roads in the transportation network layer began to rapidly decrease during this process. Even many of the living beings' strongholds or bases that had been established were gradually being reclaimed by the transportation network layer, and they had returned to their original nature. Of course, that was only the nature of it. After all, it had already been modified by those living beings, leaving a certain amount of ruins behind. It was impossible to restore it to its original state, or at the very least, it was impossible for it to change naturally. At this moment, the heavens will incarnation in the various worlds also continued to change its methods, using all sorts of strange methods to help the world overcome the world's great tribulation. This situation was as if it was avoiding something. In fact, the heavens will incarnation's actions were indeed avoiding something. However, what it was avoiding was not a true physical existence. Instead, it was avoiding the level tribulation. The level tribulation was a type of tribulation that was above the world's great tribulation. This type of tribulation used the world's great tribulation as the basic unit, or rather, it used the world's great tribulation as the node. Under such circumstances, it could be said that the worlds within the range of the level tribulation would naturally become the source of the level tribulation's power. In other words, it was the source of the transformation of power. In this way, as long as the heavens will incarnation did not disappear and did not leave the world that had been integrated into its own system, it would not be able to completely break free from the level tribulation. In other words, even if the incarnation of the heavenly axiom managed to escape the control of the plane calamity by changing its behavior and escape the fate of destroying the entire transportation network, it would only be temporary. For the level tribulation, breaking free was like a rock bouncing on water. Although it looked very arrogant and elegant, it still had to return to the water in the end and return to the control of the level tribulation. If the incarnation of the heavenly way only completed this part of the transformation and then relaxed, then the heavenly tribulation would soon adapt to the incarnation of the heavenly way. It would once again integrate the incarnation of the heavenly way into its own power, so that it could once again contribute to the destruction of the transportation network by the heavenly tribulation. After receiving guidance from Luofan, the Heaven's Will incarnation was very clear about this. Therefore, at this moment, the Heaven's Will incarnation did not calm down for even a moment. Every change was effective. After the level tribulation could no longer exert its power on itself, it quickly began another change process, and the way it dealt with the world's great tribulation also changed. Just like that, time and time again, the situation of the world changed again and again. At this moment, the entire world was enveloped by the strange brilliance that seemed terrifying but actually didn't pose much of a threat. In the next moment, the entire world seemed to have turned into sound waves and was undergoing some kind of unbelievable distortion. In the next moment, an unknown number of living beings suddenly turned into ghosts and began to attack their friends and companions on a different level. Chapter 2774. The entire transportation network layer fell into endless chaos in the blink of an eye. Many of the world founders had their own thoughts and ways to deal with it. If it was before, they might have discussed things rationally and cautiously so that they could interfere with each other as little as possible so that they would not drag each other down. However, this was clearly something that would only happen under normal circumstances. What was happening in the transportation network layer was clearly not normal. Here, it was a tribulation that targeted the transportation network layer. In such a tribulation, things that were clearly beneficial to the world founders might not necessarily satisfy the requirements of the tribulation. Therefore, under the indescribable manipulation of the tribulation, the world founders' actions became like this. Their methods influenced and interfered with each other, and in the end, they could not achieve their goals. In the end, none of them could truly sever those paths and achieve their goals. On the contrary, the damage to the transportation network layer was getting bigger and bigger as time passed, becoming more and more shocking. At this moment, Luo Fan was paying close attention to all of this, and his expression became solemn. Above the tribulation layer was a world that released endless tribulations. Although it looked rather small from here, in reality, it contained extremely many things, and its structure was indescribably complex. Just by sensing it from afar, Luo Fan could already sense an extremely vast and powerful aura from it. Under this aura, the power of the countless tribulations released from the world seemed to be moving in a seemingly random manner, but it was actually following some indescribable law. The various movements caused the tribulations in the various worlds to change, and the hearts of the founders of the worlds were also vaguely affected. Suddenly, at a certain moment, under all sorts of seemingly coincidental changes that were actually inevitable, the power released by the many founders of the world interweaved with each other and gave birth to boundless vitality. They formed countless living beings that appeared on the roads of the transportation network layer. As soon as these living beings appeared, they began to increase and sublimate at an unimaginable speed. In the beginning, they were extremely weak, and could only live and die as they pleased. They could not even gain a foothold in the transportation network layer. However, as time passed and the various changes triggered by the power of the world's founders, the living beings began to strengthen rapidly and gradually gained a foothold on the transportation network layer. Once they gained a foothold, these living beings began to expand outward. The transportation network layer could accommodate countless worlds. Although many of the paths did not truly follow the principles of space and time, under the senses of living beings, they were definitely larger than all the worlds combined. In such a place, one could imagine how much space there was for these creatures to expand and survive. It could be said that the number of living beings in this world could not even compare to the number of living beings in this world, let alone the fact that these living beings were still extremely rare. Even if all the living beings in the countless worlds were captured and stuffed into the many roads in the transportation network layer, the roads in the transportation network layer would never become crowded. Because they were creatures born in the transportation network layer, they were naturally very compatible with the transportation network layer. In other words, the living beings that could truly stabilize and gain a foothold in the transportation network layer were naturally very compatible with the transportation network layer. The living beings that did not fit in the transportation network layer had clearly been completely eliminated in the previous birth and death. Under such circumstances, the way these living beings expanded was very different from that of ordinary living beings in the world. They did not want to expand area by area, but they were radiating towards the entire transportation network layer. In other words, they did not start from the beginning and continuously expand in all directions, eventually radiating to the entire transportation network layer. Instead, when it began to expand, a huge number of living beings instantly flew to almost every location in the entire transportation network layer through the special characteristics of the transportation network layer. Then, they established a foothold in that location, multiplied, and finally brought that area under the control of living beings as well. It was as if countless water droplets were sprayed out from the starting point and turned into rain that covered the entire transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for everything to go smoothly. Just the mysteriousness of the transportation network layer itself was enough to pose a great threat to these living beings, causing them to encounter many unexpected environments from time to time. In the end, they would either defeat the environment or be eliminated by the environment. Not to mention, at this time, the many worlds in the transportation network layer were struggling with all their might, wanting to escape from the misfortune and trouble they now knew. In this situation where almost all the worlds were struggling, the chaos in the transportation network layer could be imagined. At this moment, almost every location was filled with incomparably chaotic power, and power was released everywhere, making it difficult to tidy up. Even if real cultivators entered such chaos, it would be difficult for them to survive, let alone these living beings who were only relying on their characteristics as natural living beings to survive in the transportation network layer. If they were really unlucky and encountered a chaotic region, it would be almost fatal for them. It was precisely because of this that the development speed of the living beings in the transportation network layer was restrained to a certain extent. Moreover, even those areas that developed smoothly could not maintain true peace for a long time. Perhaps at this moment everything was still stable and the world was beautiful. But in the next moment the world might collapse, and everything they were familiar with would completely collapse and disappear. However, since living beings had already been born, it was naturally impossible for them to stop developing. This was especially true for these living beings that were born from the transportation network layer. The birth of these living beings was obviously not really a coincidence, but a random result. Their birth was definitely the result of this so-called layer tribulation. And this tribulation clearly did not create these living beings just to fill up the empty roads in the transportation network layer, although Luo Fan could not truly understand the meaning of the birth of these living beings. He understood that they must have their own goals, and it could even be said that they had their own conspiracies. If he did not pay attention to them, these living beings would definitely bring great damage to the transportation network layer one day. What a wonderful tribulation! After looking at the situation in the transportation network layer for a while, Luo Fan shifted his attention to his body and mind. Don't forget, a part of that tribulation had clearly penetrated the world of laws and even his body. If he did not pay attention to it, who knew when that part of the tribulation that had penetrated the world would erupt with some power that he did not want to see, creating an outcome that he did not want to see. With a shout in his heart, Luo Fan's world of laws began to surge, quickly cleansing his body and mind, using an incomparably meticulous method to clean up the traces that existed inside and outside of his body and mind that had been penetrated by the tribulation's power. These traces were extremely obscure, and if he did not clearly know that the power had already penetrated his body, he might not have even discovered the existence of these traces. However, compared to other incomparably stubborn influences, the influence of these powers was much smaller. When he discovered the might of the tribulation, it was actually easily stripped away by her. Bit by bit, it was expelled out of his body and mind, and even further out of his world of laws. The whole process was indescribably smooth. It felt like a drop of oil had been dripped on a piece of plastic wrap. With just a light wipe, the drop of oil had been completely wiped away. It seemed that the power of the tribulation could not truly integrate with the world of laws and him. Could it be because I have passed the third great tribulation? Feeling that the infiltration had been easily resolved, Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised. At this time, he vaguely understood what would happen when the plain tribulation appeared in the true state of chaos. Perhaps, at that time, the plain tribulation was nothing more than a show for the great heaven and earth. There were no tribulations in the world of laws, and the tribulation might be able to enter the world of laws because of the connection between the world of laws and the chaotic layer it was in. However, it would definitely not be able to truly shake the foundation of the world of laws, and it would definitely not be able to truly destroy the world of laws. If the ruler of the world of laws was willing to cooperate, the tribulation would naturally be able to receive some support from here, allowing the chaotic layer to be tested, tempered, and even obtain opportunities. However, if the world of laws was unwilling, then no matter how hard the tribulation tried, it would only be a problem that could be solved with a single thought. Of course, this was only his guess at this time. It was also a guess that he had made based on the situation of the world of laws at this time, as well as his own situation. It might be true, or it might be false. There might be some subtle differences, or it might be the complete opposite. As for the specifics, he could only be sure when he really reached that level in the future and encountered such a real tribulation. Following this feeling, Luo Fan instantly came to a realization. He must not directly interfere with the tribulation of the transportation network layer this time. If he interfered directly, this level of tribulation would definitely seep into his world of laws and affect his body. If he did not directly interfere, then no matter how the tribulation changed, even if the entire transportation network layer was completely destroyed, it would not affect him at all. At most, he would just lose the transportation network layer, of course. For Luo Fan, this was because Luo Fan's world of laws had already passed through 3 great tribulations, and it had just passed through the 3rd great tribulation. Because he had just passed the tribulation, the world of laws wouldn't care about him for the time being. Although it would not be as exaggerated as ignoring him, it would definitely not deliberately target him. Of course, this was only the case for Luo Fan. For the other worlds, the situation was obviously different. For the other worlds in the transportation network layer, the tribulation at this time was their test of life and death. If they could pass through it, then not only would they be able to integrate more closely with the transportation network layer, but they could even obtain a certain level of authority in the transportation network layer. Even their own worlds would be able to pass through the great tribulation that they were currently encountering because of this. Of course, if they could not pass through it, not only would they lose the connection brought about by the transportation network layer, but even their own worlds might be destroyed because of this failure. The reason for this was that they were already a part of this tribulation, and it could even be said that they were the foundation of this tribulation. Once the tribulation succeeded, then their worlds would have to bear all the damage suffered by the transportation network layer at the same time. And once the tribulation failed, the tribulation that they encountered would also fail along with the tribulation. For them, the failure of the tribulation that their own worlds encountered would naturally mean that their own worlds had succeeded. Of course, for the many world founders, if they wanted to help the transportation network layer resist the tribulation, what they could do was very simple, and that was to refocus their attention on their own worlds and help them pass through the tribulation that their own worlds encountered as soon as possible. As mentioned before, the tribulation that their worlds encountered was a component of this tribulation. In this way, the great tribulation of their own worlds would naturally be a component that resisted the tribulation of the entire level. For this level's tribulation, this kind of resistance would naturally directly target the foundation. It went without saying how great the impact and effect would be. Of course, if there was really a world founder that was powerful enough to directly target the tribulation that the entire transportation network layer encountered and directly set off from the many paths in the transportation network layer and set off from the macroscopic region of the entire chaotic layer created by the transportation network layer to resist the tribulation, the effect would naturally not be bad. However, it was obvious that apart from Luo Fan, none of the other world founders in the transportation network layer had such an ability. However, it's not that there's no way. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly began to rejoice over the various agreements that he had made with the other world founders. Chapter 2776. Of course, the heavenly Tao incarnation was ultimately helping the world resist the world's great tribulation. Therefore, even though the situation of the world seemed rather tragic, the overall development trend of the world was still in the direction of overcoming the world's great tribulation. Naturally, there was more than one kind of change in the level tribulation. The level tribulation was a step further than the other world's great tribulations, so its changes were naturally more subtle and mysterious than the world's great tribulations. After discovering that its control over the world's tribulations had been blocked, the level tribulation gave rise to all kinds of mysterious changes that appeared on the many paths in the transportation network layer. Layers of space-time were born, and time even began to condense and take form. It seemed like the path was about to form a world. The many living beings that had fallen into internal strife on the path were affected by the changing space-time and were all sucked into it. As they were sucked into the space-time, the status and opportunities that they were fighting for naturally lost their original meaning. Although it wasn't completely meaningless, it wasn't as serious as before. In addition, the changes in the space-time were subtle and strange. Even Luo Fan didn't quite understand what the various things were, let alone the living beings. At this time, it was extremely difficult for the living beings that were sucked into the strange space-time to find each other, let alone continue fighting. Since they were no longer fighting, they naturally began to turn their attention to the outside world. Before they were sucked into the strange space-time, the target of these living beings was naturally the transportation network layer. But now, after being sucked into the strange space-time, they could only focus on the strange space-time. The existence of these space-time was due to the power of the level tribulation and the characteristics of the transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, the changes in the space-time would naturally be reflected in the transportation network layer. As the many living beings began to work together again, their original work gradually shifted to the space-time. In other words, the space-time began to gradually transform the roads in the transportation network layer into their own growth resources. They constantly absorbed the various characteristics, powers, and even more indescribable and mysterious existences of those roads, and this was only one of them. Apart from this, there were many other mysterious changes that existed in the plane tribulation. For example, the types of tribulations that ordinary living beings knew of, like the strikes of heavenly lightning, the scorching of heavenly flames, the blowing of cold winds, and so on and so forth. There were all sorts of types, and there were so many of them that it was practically impossible to imagine. At this point, even the stupidest person could see that the transportation network layer was facing a calamity. It was a tribulation similar to the Great Tribulation of the world. What tribulation is this? Why would it target the transportation network layer? The creators of the world, who were still rational, were dumbfounded as they looked at the changes in the path outside their world. The shock in their hearts was beyond words. If this tribulation were to appear in my world. Some of the founders were even more shocked by the power of this tribulation. The effect of this level of tribulation was far beyond their imagination. If they could gather this power in their own world, they would be able to find their way out in the next instant. As the shock spread, many of the pioneers who had lost their rationality due to anger and indignation finally came to their senses and realized the abnormality of their behavior. As the founders of the world, who already knew about the existence of the Great Tribulation of the world, how could they not know about the various possibilities of the tribulation? Combining the various possibilities of the Great Tribulation and their previous behavior, how could they not understand that they had been controlled by the tribulation and had become the carrier of the tribulation's power? In an instant, their displeasure, anger, and indignation towards Luo Fan began to weaken. Of course, it was impossible for them to disappear. Although their previous behavior and emotions were affected by the tribulation's power, there was no doubt that Luo Fan's laws of the world were affecting their world and shackling their minds. Obviously, for these founders of the world, if such a situation existed, it was impossible for them to have no grudges against Luo Fan. Their emotions obviously had a great impact on the tribulation. Due to their behavior, the tribulation began to give rise to various other changes. The originally strange and inexplicable space became even stranger and more mysterious at this moment. The attacks, which were already bizarre and direct, became even more bizarre. It felt like the awakening, anger, and displeasure of the world founders were also under the control of the tribulation and were also a part of it. This time, not all the world founders who had awakened could see this clearly. Most of the world founders who had awakened and could barely suppress their displeasure towards Luo Fan and their resentment towards the laws of the world felt inexplicably excited at this moment. They felt like they had finally broken free from their confinement and returned to nature. However, they didn't know that their mentality might also be under the control of some external force. Luo Fan couldn't directly resist the tribulation at this time, so he could only achieve his goal in a roundabout way. Therefore, it was naturally better to take action directly. At this time, he could only use the Heaven Tao incarnation as a medium and use it to manipulate the power of the world to indirectly influence the tribulation. Compared to the creators of the world, who were influenced and manipulated by the layer tribulation, the incarnation of the heavenly way did not have such a drawback. The Heaven Tao incarnation itself was under the complete control of Luo Fan. On the other hand, because Luo Fan's world of laws had just passed the third great tribulation of the world, he was invulnerable to all tribulations for a short period of time. Therefore, this tribulation could only slide through the world of laws, but it couldn't really be controlled by the tribulation. Therefore, Luo Fan's Li Ji naturally couldn't be affected and controlled by the tribulation. Since he couldn't, the Heaven Tao incarnation under his complete control naturally wouldn't be affected either. Therefore, at this time, the only thing that could participate in resisting this tribulation in the entire transportation network layer was the Heaven Tao incarnation of the world of laws. This situation was already much better than the situation of the true chaotic layer. For the true chaotic layer, once it encountered a tribulation, it could only rely on the nature and degree of the chaotic layer to resist it. It was impossible for the great world to participate. Unless it had just passed the great tribulation of the world, it could only become a node of the tribulation. Everything in it would become the target of the tribulation, and its power would become a part of the tribulation's power to destroy the chaotic layer. As for the worlds that had just passed the Great Tribulation, they could only watch helplessly like the Great World. After all, if it were a truly perfect world, how could it hand over the authority of its own world to the Heaven Tao incarnation of a foreign world like the other worlds in the transportation network layer? It could be said that the possibility of the transportation network layer surviving the tribulation was much higher than that of the true chaotic layer. Sensing that the tribulation of the world that many worlds encountered was constantly catching up with their own changes, the Heaven Tao incarnation gradually stabilized its own rhythm of change, allowing the worlds to gradually fall into a stable state. A stable state that could be sustained, stable, and wouldn't change too much in a short period of time. In this stable state, the Heaven Tao incarnation no longer needed to focus all its attention on the world, nor did it need to wholeheartedly help the world resist the Great Tribulation. After all, compared to before, the requirements for the Heaven Tao incarnation to resist the tribulation were much lower now. Since the requirements were much lower, it naturally didn't need to expend too much energy and effort, and it was naturally able to divert more attention to other things. The Heaven Tao incarnation itself also had the authority to manipulate the many roads in the transportation network layer. After all, it was a Heaven Tao incarnation that Luo Fan had specially created for the purpose of trading with the other creators of the world. If it wasn't given the authority to manipulate the roads, the Heaven Tao incarnation might be at a disadvantage at any time due to not being able to manipulate the road. In serious cases, it might even cause the transaction to fail. This possibility wasn't too great, but it was still there. In any case, it wasn't difficult for Luo Fan to give the Heaven Tao incarnation the authority to manipulate the roads in the transportation network layer. In fact, it didn't even require much of his power. Since that was the case, it was naturally most appropriate to directly give them this authority. Because of this decision, the incarnation of the heavenly axiom now had more possibilities in the face of the level tribulation. The Heaven's Will incarnation did not have much power. At least, compared to the level of the creator of the world and the simulated chaos layer in the state of chaos, the Heaven's Will incarnation's power was definitely insignificant. With such an insignificant amount of power, it was like trying to directly control and fight against the level disaster. It was like trying to pour a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood. It was impossible to achieve his goal. However, these Heaven's Tao avatars all possess the authority to control the world, borrow the power of the world, and use the power of the world. With such authority, these heavenly axioms could be said to be the embodiment of a part of the world. Although compared to the entire transportation network layer, one side of the world was not considered much. After all, it was already on the same level, above the same level. If they wanted to use the world as a foundation to change the entire transportation network layer and resist the power of the tribulations that wreaked havoc in the transportation network layer, it had already become possible from the original impossible. Of course, at this moment, when the level disaster and the roads beyond the world were wreaking havoc, the roads in the transportation network layer could almost be said to exist in name only. Wanting to extend the power of the world, or in other words, wanting to extend the power of the world that was not under the control of the level disaster beyond the world was unimaginably difficult. At the very least, it was more than 100 times more difficult than before. Under such circumstances, even the world that was the fastest took hundreds of years to truly control the power of the world beyond the world and began to truly seep into the road. It began to collide with the power of the many tribulations that existed on the road. As the first wisp of the power of the world collided with the power of the tribulations, a strange change began to occur. The originally chaotic transportation network layer seemed to have been enraged at this moment, and it began to erupt with terrifying attacks that were many times more powerful than before. Countless unimaginable changes appeared on those paths even faster. All sorts of unimaginable and terrifying creatures were born in the various space-time spaces. Even the space-time spaces began to unite, resulting in earth-shattering changes. Endless power connected with each other, turning into all sorts of indescribable brilliance that converged at the point where the power came into contact, or rather, at the point where the power came into contact. Damn it! The creator of the world could not help but scream at this moment. The impact of this collision on his world was unimaginably great. The one that collided was the power or might of his heaven and earth, and this power or might was clearly drawn from everywhere in this world, so it naturally connected with everything in this world. If it was an ordinary shock or impact, it naturally would not affect the world. However, at this moment, the power of the level disaster was completely different. The power of the level disaster itself was made up of the level disaster that the various worlds encountered as nodes and unit. This world was naturally a part of the power of the level disaster, a part of the node. Under such circumstances, the collision between the power of the level disaster and the power of the world was equivalent to a person's two hands colliding. Under such circumstances, it could be said that no matter which side the impact was aimed at, it would eventually converge on this side of the world and naturally manifest itself in this side of the world.